Oh, stumbling upon this quiet refuge is no accident. Perhaps the Force guided your steps here. Follow me, sit beside the fire, and take some rest. There's a long road ahead of you among the stars, so feel free to ease your mind and listen to my tales. Tonight, I'll tell you of a shadow that once fell across the whole galaxy, a time some call the Dark Times. It began with thunderous applause in a marble senate, and it ended in fire above a forest moon. This is the story of the Galactic Empire, from its first breath to its final fall. So settle in, weary one, and let the years drift past like stars. The Galactic Republic had stood for a very long time before the Empire ever drew its first breath. For roughly 25,000 years, it served as the great unifying government of the galaxy, binding thousands upon thousands of worlds together beneath a single banner. It began small, in the bright and settled worlds near the center of the galaxy, the systems that later generations would come to call the core. Alderaan and Chandrila were among these founding worlds, peaceful places whose people believed in talking rather than fighting, and they confederated together in common cause. Over the long millennia that followed, they reached outward, welcoming like-minded societies into their fold, extending their laws and their trade and their culture along the great hyperspace lanes until the Republic touched nearly every corner of the known galaxy. At the heart of it all sat the planet Coruscant, a world so thoroughly built upon that its natural surface had long since vanished beneath endless layers of towers, walkways, and glittering spires. Here rose the Senate, a vast domed chamber where representatives from countless worlds gathered to debate and to vote, each of them speaking for the people who had sent them. And guiding the Republic through its brighter centuries were the Jedi, an order of peacekeepers who drew their strength from the Force, the mysterious energy that flowed through all living things. The Jedi carried glowing blades called lightsabers, and they answered the call of the Senate to settle disputes and protect the weak, serving as guardians of peace and justice for 1,000 generations. Yet by the time our story truly begins, that long peace had grown brittle and worn. The galaxy had fallen into a terrible conflict known as the Clone Wars, a war that raged for 3 years and touched worlds beyond counting. On one side stood the Republic, defended by a vast army of clone soldiers, each one grown and trained for battle, and led into war by the Jedi themselves. On the other side stood the Separatists, a great confederacy of worlds and powerful business interests that had broken away from the Republic, fielding endless legions of battle droids. The fighting spread from the deep core all the way to the farthest reaches of the Outer Rim, and everywhere it went, it left ruin and grief behind it. Presiding over the Republic through all of this was the Supreme Chancellor, a soft-spoken man named Palpatine, who had risen from the Senate of the quiet world Naboo. When the war first broke out, the frightened Senate had granted him emergency powers so that he might act swiftly against the crisis. And as the war dragged on, they allowed him to remain in office long past the end of his lawful term, trusting that he would surrender his authority once peace returned. To the galaxy at large, Palpatine seemed a patient and devoted servant of the Republic, weary from the burdens of leadership, always promising that the end of the war was near. But beneath that gentle surface lay a truth that only a handful of beings suspected. Palpatine wore a second face and answered to a second name. In the shadows, he was Darth Sidious, a dark lord of the Sith, heir to an ancient order of Force wielders who had sworn themselves to hatred, ambition, and the pursuit of absolute power. The Sith had been thought extinct for 1,000 years, hunted to the edge of memory by the Jedi, and yet they had survived in secret, passing their dark knowledge from master to apprentice, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. Sidious had spent his entire life weaving a single vast design, and the Clone Wars themselves were part of it. He had secretly created both sides of the conflict, guiding the Separatists with one hand while defending the Republic with the other, so that whichever side won, he alone would gain. The galaxy, worn down by 3 long years of bloodshed, had grown desperate for the war to end. Whole worlds had been shattered, families torn apart, and countless soldiers and civilians laid to rest. Everywhere, people longed for a return to calm and safety, for a leader strong enough to make the killing stop. That longing, that deep and honest exhaustion, was the very thing Sidious had been counting on all along. A frightened people, he understood, would trade a great deal of freedom for the mere promise of peace, and they would even applaud as they did it. And so, as the Clone Wars ground toward their final hours, the trap that had been decades in the making was ready at last to close, beginning with a single command that would echo across the entire galaxy in the space of a single, terrible night. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine sat in his crimson-draped office on Coruscant and activated a secure holographic channel. He transmitted a single, pre-recorded command across the military frequencies to the clone trooper commanders stationed on thousands of battlefronts. Deep within the brains of these soldiers, microscopic organic inhibitor chips responded to the incoming signal. Kaminoan cloners had implanted these biochips into the clones during their earliest stages of embryonic development in the aquatic cloning facilities of Kamino. The electrical impulses from the chips released specific chemical compounds directly into the troopers' neural pathways. Their pupils dilated, their heart rates steadied, the biochemical shift altered their neural patterns, linking their motor functions directly to the Chancellor's voice commands. The Jedi immediately registered in the clones' tactical visors and organic minds as high-level military targets. The soldiers locked their joints, tightened their grips on their weapons, and executed the directive. On the ash-covered bridges of Maigito, clone Marines stopped their forward march against the droid army. They turned around in unison, raised their heavy rotary blasters, and fired directly into the chest of Jedi Master Ki-Adi-Mundi. The bolts burned through his robes as he raised his lightsaber, and he collapsed onto the metal grating of the bridge. On the sinkhole world of Utapau, clone artillery gunners adjusted the targeting sensors on their 6-legged ATTE walkers. They aimed their main cannons at the cliff face where Obi-Wan Kenobi rode his scaled varactyl mount. The cannon shells struck the rock, shattering the stone ledge and sending both rider and mount plummeting into the deep underground waters below. In the towering fungal forests of Felucia, clone infantrymen surrounded Jedi Knight Aayla Secura. They raised their DC-15A rifles and discharged a volley of blue plasma bolts into her back. The impact threw her forward, and the troopers continued to fire their weapons long after she fell onto the glowing flora of the forest floor, scorching the surrounding mushroom stalks with stray shots. Above the suspended bridge cities of Cato Neimoidia, clone pilots pulled back on their flight yokes and locked their targeting computers onto the starfighter of Jedi Master Plo Koon. They pressed their firing studs, unleashing twin green laser bolts that sheared right through the fighter's engine block. Smoke trailed from the fuselage as the craft spun out of control and shattered against the egg-shaped spires of the Neimoidian architecture. On the muddy beaches of Kashyyyk, clone commanders ordered their massive juggernaut tanks to halt their advance. They redirected their heavy ordnance toward Jedi Master Yoda, who stood on a wooden command platform. Yoda felt the physical shift in the troopers moving behind him. He ignited his green lightsaber, leaped backward over their shoulders, and severed the heads of his 2 personal guards with a single, sweeping strike. He scrambled up the wooden structures of the Wookiee tree cities and disappeared into the dense, damp foliage, leaving the clones to search the underbrush with sweep lights and tracker hounds. Across thousands of worlds, 10,000 Force wielders fell under the sudden, coordinated blaster fire of their own armies, leaving their bodies scattered across trenches, command centers, and alien landscapes. Back on Coruscant, a massive column of clone troopers marched up the sweeping stone steps of the Jedi Temple. Thousands of boots hit the permacrete in perfect unison, their white armor gleaming under the city's artificial lights. Leading them was Anakin Skywalker. He wore a dark hooded cloak over his leather tunic, and his mechanical right hand gripped the hilt of his lightsaber. The yellow hue of the Sith colored his irises. He walked beneath the towering archways as Darth Vader, the new apprentice to Darth Sidious. He ignited his blue blade and drove it through the chest of the temple gatekeeper. Clone troopers flooded through the main entrances behind him, spreading out across the archives, the training dojos, and the meditation chambers. Blaster bolts scorched the ancient stone pillars, shattering statues and igniting the tapestries hanging from the high ceilings. Temple guards ignited yellow double-bladed lightsabers and engaged the clones on the Great Concourse. The clone troopers grouped together, knelt on the polished floors, and unleashed concentrated volleys of heavy fire that burned right through the guards' armor and dropped them to the ground. Smoke drifted through the grand halls, carrying the scent of ionized air, melting plastoid, and burning cloth. Darth Vader strode through the corridors, cutting down Jedi Masters, knights, and younglings alike with heavy, two-handed strikes. In the Room of 1,000 Fountains, clone snipers took positions on the elevated rock formations. They aimed through their thermal scopes, tracking the heat signatures of Jedi Padawans, and shot them as they swam across the artificial rivers. Vader walked past the cascading waterfalls, his heavy boots leaving wet tracks on the marble floors. He blocked incoming lightsaber strikes with precise, rigid motions, pushed retreating Jedi against the stone walls, and pierced their chests. The temple's internal comlink systems broadcasted loud, automated warning klaxons, echoing down the empty halls alongside the rhythmic marching of clone boots and the hiss of plasma blades. Bodies lay scattered across the polished floors among shattered glass, severed limbs, and scorched holocrons. When the sun rose over the Coruscant skyline, black smoke poured from the roof of the Jedi Temple and drifted across the morning sky. Clone troopers piled the bodies of the fallen onto metal transport skiffs and hauled away the ancient holocrons from the archives in heavy cargo crates. Supreme Chancellor Palpatine stood on the balcony of his office, his hands clasped behind his back, watching the dark plumes rise above the cityscape. He turned around, adjusted the heavy fabric of his robes, and walked down the hallway toward his private turbolift. He had summoned the thousands of representatives of the Galactic Senate for an extraordinary session. The vast rotunda awaited his arrival, where he would step onto the central podium, activate his microphone, and address the galaxy for the first time since the slaughter began. Palpatine stepped onto the high central podium of the Galactic Senate and activated the repulsor lifts. The circular platform detached from the floor and hovered upward into the center of the vast chamber, surrounded by thousands of floating repulsor pods, each carrying representatives from different star systems. The bright overhead lights reflected off his heavy, crimson robes. He gripped the edges of the metal railing, leaned toward the audio pickups, and spoke into the microphones. He declared to the gathered senators that the Jedi Order had staged a violent rebellion, attempting to assassinate him in his private office and overthrow the legitimate government of the Republic. He pointed to his own face, scarred and misshapen from his encounter with the Jedi Master Mace Windu, presenting the deep wrinkles and pale, sunken skin as physical proof of the Jedi's betrayal. He announced that the remaining Jedi would be hunted down and eliminated to ensure the safety of the citizens. He then presented his solution for the galaxy's future. The Republic, he explained, had grown too weak and divided to protect its people from internal treason and external threats. To prevent such chaos from ever happening again, he decreed that the Galactic Republic would be reorganized into the First Galactic Empire. He spoke of a new, secure society, built upon strength and order, and promised that this new empire would endure for 10,000 years. The new structure would eliminate the slow, deliberative processes of the old Senate, replacing them with swift, decisive executive action under his direct command as the new Galactic Emperor. As his words echoed through the massive acoustic chamber, the response from the politicians was immediate. Thousands of senators leaned forward in their repulsopods, activated their voting switches, and stamped their feet on the metal decking. They cheered, clapped their hands, and shouted their approval. The sound of thunderous applause filled the Senate rotunda, bouncing off the curved walls and drowning out any dissenting voices. Representatives from powerful corporate factions and wealthy core worlds waved their arms in celebration, eager for the profitable stability the Emperor promised. They had grown tired of the Clone Wars and willingly handed over the last remnants of their democratic power in exchange for the guarantee of personal security and economic order. A few senators sat quietly in their pods and watched the spectacle unfold. Padme Amidala of Naboo gripped the edge of her console, her knuckles turning white against the metal. She looked around at the cheering crowds, her eyes wide, and spoke quietly to Bail Organa of Alderaan, observing that the death of liberty was accompanied by thunderous applause. Across the chamber, Mon Mothma of Chandrila folded her hands in her lap, pressing her lips together as she listened to the Emperor's words. She looked at the scarred face on the giant holoscreens and recognized the calculated deception in his voice. She kept her silence, knowing that any public objection in that moment would mark her as a traitor to the new regime. They remained in their seats while the rest of the galaxy's representatives celebrated the death of the Republic. In the days that followed, workers arrived at the Senate building and began dismantling the old symbols of the Republic. They unbolted the 8-pointed star crests from the walls and replaced them with the 6-spoked Imperial cog. The Galactic Senate officially became the Imperial Senate, serving now as an advisory body rather than a legislative one. The Emperor retained the politicians to manage the local bureaucracies, keeping them comfortable in their high-rise apartments, while he steadily stripped away their actual authority. The date of Palpatine's declaration was entered into the official galactic calendar as Empire Day, a mandatory public holiday marked by military parades, the deployment of new starships, and loud, synchronized displays of Imperial power across the core worlds. The transition from democracy to dictatorship was complete, entirely legal, and documented in the official Senate records for all to see. Palpatine relocated his residence from the Executive Office building to the former Jedi Temple on Coruscant. Construction droids stripped the ancient stone walls and installed black durasteel plating across the exterior. The 5 towering spires of the temple received heavy modifications, and workers welded massive sensor arrays and transmission dishes over the meditation chambers. Inside the highest tower, Palpatine sat on a rotating chair, elevated above the main floor. The circular window behind him looked out over the endless urban sprawl of the city planet. He wore a heavy black robe that absorbed the dim light of the room. From this chair, he issued verbal commands and signed electronic data pads that dictated the movement of resources and military personnel across millions of star systems. To manage the sheer physical scale of the galaxy, Palpatine divided the star maps into thousands of new sectors. He appointed men and women from loyal core worlds to serve as Moffs and Grand Moffs. These officials wore tailored olive-grey tunics with silver code cylinders slotted into their shoulder pockets. Rows of blue and red rectangular plaques rested on their left breasts, designating their rank within the new hierarchy. The Moffs deployed from Coruscant to their assigned sectors and set up command centers inside planetary capital buildings. They directed local security forces to seize control of spaceports, mining facilities, and agricultural processing plants. Imperial officers stood on loading docks with datapad manifests, counting crates of raw Tabana gas, raw coaxium, and harvested grain as cargo lifters loaded them onto armored transport ships bound for the core worlds. They carried heavy blaster pistols on their belts and communicated through encrypted comlinks to coordinate the loading processes. The shipyards at Kuat, Corellia, and Fondor operated through all hours of the local planetary cycles. Automated welding arms showered the orbital dry docks with bright orange sparks as workers assembled the hulls of Imperial-class star destroyers. These capital ships measured over 1,600 meters in length, shaped like flat, grey wedges. They carried heavy turbo-laser batteries along their trenches and housed thousands of crew members within their multi-level decks. When a star destroyer entered a planet's atmosphere, its massive bulk blocked out the sun, casting a physical shadow over entire cities. The sublight engines emitted a low, bone-rattling hum that vibrated through the windows of the buildings below. On the ground, the Imperial Army deployed new mechanized walkers to replace the vehicles of the Clone Wars. The All-Terrain Armored Transport, or AT-AT, stood over 20 meters tall on 4 articulated mechanical legs. Engineers designed the bulky, heavily armored body to carry dozens of soldiers and speeder bikes into combat zones. During deployment, the heavy metal footpads slammed into the dirt, cracking the crust of the earth and sending vibrations through the ground that soldiers could feel miles away. The thick durasteel plating covering their legs deflected incoming blaster fire, leaving only small scorch marks on the grey paint. The chin-mounted heavy laser cannons fired red bursts of concentrated energy that shattered permacrete bunkers and ignited forests. Alongside these machines marched the stormtroopers, the new face of the Imperial military. Human recruits from across the galaxy replaced the aging clone troopers in the ranks. They wore stark white plastoid armor over black body gloves, equipped with polarized dark lenses set into their helmets. The armor pieces rattled together with a distinct, uniform clicking sound as squads patrolled the streets of occupied planets. They carried standard-issue E-11 blaster rifles resting across their chest plates. The stormtroopers established checkpoints at the intersections of major thoroughfares. They stopped passing speeders, demanded physical identification cards from drivers, and detained citizens carrying forged transit documents inside holding cells. Back on Coruscant, the physical remnants of the old government underwent rapid dismantling. Maintenance crews removed the colorful tapestries and intricate murals from the corridors of the Senate Rotunda. They painted the walls in flat, uniform shades of gray and white. Workers replaced the warm yellow lighting of the previous era with harsh, blue-white lumina panels that cast sharp shadows across the faces of the politicians. Laborers shoveled Republic credits into massive smelting vats. Droids stamped the molten metal into new Imperial ingots, pressing the six-spoked cog emblem onto every physical coin. The Emperor mandated the replacement of the galactic basic alphabet on official signage, instructing automated painters to stencil the new Imperial block text over the old letters. Palpatine dispatched fleet admirals to patrol the hyperspace lanes and deployed auditors to enforce the new physical tax codes. One specific directive held his continuous attention. Deep within the shielded data vaults of the Imperial Palace, astromech droids processed the intercepted communications and flight logs from the final days of the Clone Wars. They compiled lists of starships operating under false transponder codes and isolated energy signatures matching the frequency of kyber crystals. The glowing blue holoprojections displayed the faces, names, and last known coordinates of the Force wielders who survived the initial purge. The Emperor transmitted these highly classified dossiers directly to a specialized facility in the industrial sector of Coruscant, setting the physical parameters for a galaxy-wide hunt. Imperial security droids projected blue holographic wanted posters across the crowded spaceports of the core worlds. The posters displayed the faces of Jedi Knights and Masters, rotating above text that labeled them as armed traitors to the new empire. Bounties measured in tens of thousands of credits flashed beneath their moving images. Stormtroopers marched through the docking bays, stopping civilians in brown cloaks and demanding to inspect the contents of their travel bags. Bounty hunters tracked rumors of individuals displaying extraordinary reflexes, eager to cash in on the Imperial rewards. The official broadcast networks ran continuous loops of Palpatine's Senate address, pairing his words with sliced security footage showing Jedi igniting their weapons inside the Chancellor's office. Before the new Imperial apparatus locked down the hyperspace routes, a small CR-90 Corvette jumped out of the Coruscant system. Inside the medical bay, medical droids had just delivered newborn twins. Bail Organa of Alderaan took the infant girl, Leia. He carried her wrapped in white blankets aboard his sleek consular ship, back to the mountainous, green landscape of his homeworld, claiming her as the daughter of his royal house. Obi-Wan Kenobi took the infant boy, Luke. He traveled aboard a dusty freighter to the desert planet of Tatooine, a harsh world orbiting binary suns. He handed the boy to Owen and Beru Lars, who stood outside their domed moisture farm in the blowing sand. Obi-Wan walked away from the moisture farm and established a camp in the rocky cliffs of the Jundland wastes. He buried his lightsaber and the lightsaber of his former apprentice deep inside a metal chest under the sand, wearing only the rough-spun robes of a local hermit. Far across the galaxy, Yoda navigated a small escape pod through the dense, cloud-covered atmosphere of Dagobah. The pod crashed into a murky swamp, sinking halfway into the dark water. Yoda climbed out into the humid air, surrounded by massive, twisting roots and the thick smell of decaying plant matter. He built a small hut from mud and fallen branches, sustaining himself on root leaf stew and watching the rain ripple across the surface of the bogs. Other survivors discarded their identities and blended into the industrial labor forces of the Outer Rim. Ahsoka Tano, the former apprentice to Anakin Skywalker, traded her lightsabers for welding tools. She wore grease-stained work clothes and repaired agricultural machinery on farming moons, keeping her head down and her leku hidden beneath a bulky mechanic's cowl. Whenever Imperial transports landed on the dirt landing pads, she packed her few tools into a canvas satchel and walked out the back exits of the repair shops. Surviving Jedi dismantled their lightsabers, dropping the kyber crystals into deep riverbeds or melting the metal hilts in forge fires. Imperial troop transports landed daily in the centers of ancient cities, crushing the cobblestone plazas underneath heavy treads. Strip mining machines chewed through the forests of resource-rich planets, pumping thick black exhaust into the atmosphere and turning clear rivers into toxic sludge. Citizens whispered the phrase "dark times" while looking at the new grey Durasteel garrisons blocking their skylines and the polluted clouds hanging overhead. Pedestrians walked with their heads down, pulling their collars up against the cold wind and turning their eyes away from the white-armored patrols. Curfew sirens blared over the public loudspeakers at dusk, and heavy blast doors slid shut across the market districts. Neighbors watched each other through the gaps in their window blinds, writing down the names of anyone who stayed out late or purchased extra food rations. The scattered Jedi maintained constant physical vigilance. They slept on thin cots in the cargo holds of deep space freighters or curled up in narrow crawl spaces beneath the floorboards of abandoned outposts. At the sound of heavy boots on metal decking, their hands darted toward the empty spaces on their belts. They memorized the exits of every cantina they entered, sitting with their backs against the walls and watching the reflections in the dirty mirrors over the bar. Every transport engine whining in the distance caused them to freeze and listen. They lifted heavy crates with raw physical exertion and treated scraped hands with basic bandages. Using their abilities drew immediate attention, triggering silent alarms on the Imperial holonet. The Emperor knew that regular stormtroopers and bounty hunters lacked the reflexes to reliably track and kill trained Jedi. He required agents who could sense the distinct energy signatures of the Force and match the combat speed of his enemies. Deep within the industrial sectors of Coruscant, Darth Vader walked into a dimly lit training facility to meet with a group of former Jedi who had sworn loyalty to the Empire. They wore black segmented armor and held specialized ringed lightsaber hilts. Vader stepped onto the dueling mat, ready to test the physical strength of this newly formed coven. Inside the Fortress Inquisitorius, on the moon of Nur, men and women in black armor stood on a circular dueling mat. Heavy transparent steel windows held back the crushing pressure of the dark water outside. These individuals formed the Inquisitorius. They were former Jedi Knights and Padawans who had survived the initial purge and surrendered to the Empire. Interrogation droids had subjected them to electroshock restraints and chemical injections until they pledged their loyalty to the dark side. Now, they wielded the power of their masters, tasked with hunting down their former allies. Leading this coven stood the Grand Inquisitor. He was a gaunt Pauan male with pale skin lined by vertical red tattoos running from his forehead down to his jawline. Before the Republic fell, he had worn the yellow robes and featureless mask of a Jedi temple guard. Now, he wore a tailored black uniform with a high, stiff collar and an Imperial crest stamped on the shoulder plating. He carried a unique weapon clipped to his belt, a lightsaber with a circular metallic ring around the primary hilt. When he pressed the activation stud, 2 red plasma blades ignited from opposite ends. The internal gyroscopes allowed the blades to spin rapidly along the ring's track, creating a continuous red shield. He used this spinning mechanism to deflect blaster bolts and execute targets with a sweeping motion. The Emperor stripped the Inquisitors of their original birth names and assigned them new numerical designations alongside familial titles. A female Mirialan with geometric facial tattoos answered to the title of Seventh Sister. A bulky, grey-skinned humanoid with heavy cybernetic implants across his jaw walked the corridors as the fifth brother. A tall, dark-haired human female received the designation of Second Sister. Citizens simply called them the Red Blades. They recognized their black uniforms and the red glow of their weapons. The Inquisitors utilized specialized TIE Advanced V1 starfighters featuring curved solar array wings to travel across sectors. They landed their ships in the center of populated spaceports, lowered the entry ramps, and walked through the busy markets. Market vendors lowered their eyes to the dirt, and civilians backed against the stone walls to clear wide paths through the streets. The Inquisitors received detailed intelligence reports from Imperial probe droids and local informants eager for a bounty. They tracked rumors of individuals moving heavy cargo using only the Force. Upon locating a surviving Jedi, the Inquisitors deployed in pairs to overwhelm their target through coordinated, aggressive strikes. They swung their heavy, spinning blades to break through defensive parries and pushed their opponents into corners using kinetic bursts of Force energy. They secured the survivors in heavy iron binders and dragged them up the ramps of their transport ships. Their secondary objective involved locating and capturing infants and young children who exhibited sensitivity to the Force. The Empire classified this operation as Project Harvester. Squads of stormtroopers accompanied the Inquisitors into civilian homes, medical centers, and planetary orphanages. They scanned blood samples of young children using handheld medical devices, looking for high cellular counts that indicated a strong connection to the Force. When a scanner registered a positive match, the stormtroopers placed the child into a specialized, sealed containment capsule. They loaded the capsules onto heavily armored shuttles and transported the children to hidden Imperial facilities. Medical technicians and conditioning droids subjected the captured youth to strict neurological reprogramming, altering their brain chemistry to serve as Imperial spies, future Inquisitors, or specialized seers for the Emperor. In direct response to the Red Blades and Project Harvester, groups of ordinary civilians, mechanics, and smugglers established a clandestine transit network known as the Hidden Path. They constructed false bulkheads in the cargo holds of their light freighters, leaving just enough room for a person to lie flat, and dug subterranean tunnels beneath the dirt floors of their repair shops. When a surviving Jedi or a family with a Force-sensitive child needed to escape, operatives of the Hidden Path provided them with forged identification codes and physical safe houses. They transmitted coordinates using low-frequency, encrypted comlink bursts, directing the fugitives from one secure location to the next. The safe houses contained sealed ration bars, clean water pouches, and basic medical supplies stored in metal crates. Small etchings of a specific, connected line pattern marked the heavy durasteel doors and dark alleyways leading to these refuges, guiding the desperate travelers through the shadows of the urban centers. Operatives moved the refugees along the hyperspace lanes to uncharted, remote worlds located beyond the immediate reach of the Imperial sector fleets. The Inquisitors reported their progress, their captured targets, and their occasional failures directly to a single commanding officer. Whenever an Inquisitor failed to capture a target or execute a high-profile survivor, this supreme commander arrived at the fortress to administer physical punishment. He stood much taller than the Grand Inquisitor, encased entirely in heavy black durasteel armor and a sweeping cape that dragged along the floor. A mechanized breathing apparatus dominated his chest plate, emitting a loud, rhythmic rasp that echoed down the metal hallways long before he stepped into the training dojos. He carried a traditional, heavy lightsaber on his belt, producing a thick, crimson blade that he used to correct the mistakes of his subordinates. The Inquisitors dropped to their knees on the polished floors, the moment the Emperor's chief enforcer entered the room. Inside the spherical, pressurized hyperbaric meditation chamber aboard his flagship, mechanical pincers lowered a heavy black helmet onto the scarred, pale head of Darth Vader. Thick, raised burn tissue covered his face and torso, the physical marks of his duel with Obi-Wan Kenobi on the black sandbanks of the volcanic planet Mustafar. Medical droids had amputated his ruined biological limbs and grafted heavy cybernetic prosthetics to his remaining bone and muscle. He required a sealed life support suit to survive the atmospheric pressure of standard environments. A specialized respirator pumped synthesized oxygen directly into his damaged lungs, creating a loud, rhythmic mechanical hiss that accompanied every breath. A control box strapped to his chest plate monitored his cardiac rhythms and regulated the temperature of his black body glove. He stepped out of the chamber, his heavy, magnetized boots clanking against the metal deck, pulling a thick black cape behind him. Vader served as the Emperor's chief enforcer, operating above the standard military hierarchy. He answered exclusively to Palpatine. Together, the two men embodied the ancient Sith rule of two, consisting of a master possessing ultimate power and an apprentice executing his commands. Vader traveled to the Fortress Inquisitorius on the moon of Nur to oversee the physical training of the Red Blades. He walked into the combat dojos, ignited his crimson lightsaber, and engaged the Inquisitors in close-quarters combat. He struck with heavy, two-handed downward blows, shattering their defensive stances and forcing them to their knees. He demonstrated forms of lightsaber combat designed to maximize blunt force trauma, bruising the wrists of his students to teach them the cost of poor positioning. When an Inquisitor left their flank exposed, Vader thrust his metal hand forward, unleashing a kinetic wave of force energy that threw the combatant across the room into the durasteel walls. He demanded physical perfection and absolute obedience from the Coven, punishing errors with severe, physical reprimands involving his plasma blade and his raw telekinetic strength. While the Inquisitors tracked down low-level targets, Vader personally led the operations to eliminate Jedi Masters and high-profile survivors. He rode in the cockpit of his customized Black T-I Advanced Starfighter, tracking transponder signals to remote outposts on the edge of the Outer Rim. Upon landing, he walked down the shuttle ramp and marched directly toward the suspected safe houses. When a surviving Jedi ignited their weapon and charged, Vader met their strikes with precise, rigid blocks. He utilized the hydraulic strength of his mechanical arms to overpower their parries, driving his red blade through their torsos and leaving cauterized wounds in their chests. He retrieved their fallen lightsabers, clipped the metallic cylinders to his heavy leather belt, and carried them back to his shuttle to enter into the Imperial archives. The heavy footfalls of his boots echoed against the metal grating of his capital ships, announcing his arrival moments before the automatic blast doors slid open. Fleet admirals and seasoned generals locked their knees and held their breath when Vader walked onto the command bridges of the Star Destroyers. Sweat pooled on their foreheads, and their hands visibly trembled as they handed him tactical data pads. They cleared their throats and maintained perfectly straight posture while giving their reports. When a commander failed to secure a sector or lost a vital supply shipment, Vader raised his black-gloved hand and pinched his thumb and forefinger together. He applied targeted kinetic pressure directly to the officer's trachea, using the dark side of the Force. The failing officer grabbed at their own throat, gasped for air, and collapsed onto the polished black floorboards. The surrounding crew members kept their eyes locked on their console screens, tapping their keypads and continuing their work in complete silence. Between his combat missions, Vader sat alone inside his hyperbaric chamber. The automated pincers removed his helmet, exposing his damaged biological eyes to the dim light of the pod. He stared at the mechanical joints of his artificial hands, watching the pistons expand and contract as he flexed his synthetic fingers. The needles of his life support system pierced his skin, pumping dark fluids and painkillers into his bloodstream. The physical agony of his burns and severed nerve endings remained constant, providing a continuous source of fuel for his connection to the dark side. He surrounded himself with the mechanical hum of his machinery, isolating the remaining biological fragments of Anakin Skywalker behind layers of plasteel armor, synthetic leather, and diagnostic cables. He stepped back out of his chamber and walked to the primary viewport of his Star Destroyer. He folded his hands behind his back and looked down at the curvature of the planets rotating below the orbital blockades. The massive hulls of his fleet blocked the sunlight from reaching the continents of these worlds. Down on the surface, the daily routines of billions of citizens shifted to accommodate the new Imperial directives. Sirens mounted on tall poles blared through the city streets at dawn, waking the residents in their cramped apartment blocks. Laborers put on grey utility jumpsuits and walked in single-file lines toward the massive industrial processing facilities. Loudspeakers mounted above the factory doors recited lists of production quotas and local curfew regulations. Stormtroopers stood at the facility entrances with their E-11 blaster rifles resting across their chest plates, checking the physical identification cards of every worker passing through the heavy Durasteel gates. Men and women in drab grey coveralls walked in straight lines across the permacrete plazas of manufacturing worlds, and they held their stamped identification chain codes out for inspection at every street corner. Stormtroopers clad in white plastoid armor stood behind Durasteel barricades to block the pedestrian walkways. The troopers pointed their E-11 blaster rifles at the approaching citizens and snatched the identification cards from their hands. They scanned the barcodes with handheld readers, checked the serial numbers against glowing blue datapads, and gestured for the workers to move forward into the industrial zones. The heavy black boots of the Imperial patrols clacked against the pavement in a constant rhythm, echoing between the high-rise apartment blocks from dawn until dusk. Giant holographic projectors mounted on the sides of the buildings displayed repeating videos of Supreme Chancellor Palpatine. His massive blue face smiled down at the marching crowds, and the audio speakers broadcasted his voice, promising a safe and secure society. Below the glowing face of the Emperor, a stormtrooper grabbed a human mechanic by the shoulder, shoved him against a brick wall, and clamped metal binders around his wrists. The Imperial Ministry of Information controlled every physical broadcast tower across the galaxy. Maintenance technicians climbed the transmission spires, disconnected the local civilian routing cables, and hardwired the satellite dishes directly into the Imperial HoloNet grid. Families sat on worn couches inside their cramped living quarters and watched the standardized public feeds. The screens displayed synchronized military parades on Coruscant, showing thousands of Imperial cadets marching in perfect formation beneath the floating banners of the Imperial crest. The newscasters wore identical grey suits, sat behind polished metal desks, and read approved statements from physical flimsiplast sheets. They reported massive grain harvests on agricultural worlds and detailed the construction of new medical facilities in the core. At the exact same moment, Imperial Security Bureau agents wearing stark white tunics walked into local broadcast stations in the Outer Rim. They pulled local journalists from their chairs, smashed their transmission consoles with heavy metal batons, and locked the studio doors with thick magnetic seals. Massive Imperial resource extractors landed on the surfaces of fertile planets and extended heavy drilling rigs into the soil. The rotating metal teeth of the drills ground through miles of rock, uprooting ancient forests and sending massive trees crashing to the ground. Strip mining crawlers drove over the broken timber, crushing the wood into splinters beneath their heavy treads. They scooped the exposed coaxium and dunium ore onto wide mechanical conveyor belts, and the belts carried the raw materials directly into the cargo bays of waiting transport ships. The exhaust vents of the mining machines pumped thick clouds of black ash into the atmosphere, blocking the sunlight and turning the sky a deep, bruised grey. Chemical runoff from the Tabana gas refineries spilled from metal drainage pipes into the natural river systems, turning the clear water into toxic, bubbling sludge. The native populations stood on the dusty ridges above the valleys, watching the automated lifters carry the extracted metal and gas up into orbit toward the Imperial shipyards. Imperial engineers built towering permacrete walls around the planetary capitals to physically separate humans from alien species. On worlds like Lothal and Corellia, human officers and bureaucrats walked through the climate-controlled corridors of the central command centers, wearing polished black boots and tailored uniforms. Outside the perimeter walls, non-human species gathered in overcrowded, dirt-floored labor camps. Imperial garrison commanders bolted signs written strictly in Galactic Basic across the entrances of cantinas, medical clinics, and transit hubs. Squads of stormtroopers patrolled the perimeter fences, carrying electroshock batons on their belts. They directed Wookiees, Twi'leks, and Lasat laborers toward the heavy cargo docks, shouting commands in Basic and striking the backs of anyone who stopped walking. Imperial technicians clamped heavy metallic inhibitor collars around the necks of the physically stronger alien species, forcing them to carry oversized crates of starship plating under the heat of the midday suns. Imperial officers mounted listening devices the size of small coins to the undersides of cantina tables, the edges of public holoscreens, and the support beams of subterranean transit stations. Automated Imperial probe droids hovered near marketplace stalls, recording the vocal frequencies of the shoppers and transmitting the audio logs back to the local ISB garrisons. When a citizen spoke loudly against the taxation rates or the food shortages, a black armored troop transport landed in front of their residence in the middle of the night. Death troopers in specialized black armor kicked the front doors off their hinges, aimed their blasters equipped with blinding tactical lights into the dark rooms, and dragged the individuals out by their collars. The transports lifted off into the night sky, leaving the neighbors to stare at the empty, broken doorways. Deep within the lower levels of these occupied cities, small groups of mechanics, dock workers, and former politicians gathered in dark basements. They wrapped thick blankets over the ventilation grates to muffle their voices and used encrypted short-range comlinks to communicate. A mechanic placed a stolen Imperial blaster pistol onto a wooden table, while a smuggler handed over a data cylinder containing the guard patrol schedules for the local armory. They traced routes on physical star maps spread across the floor and counted stolen ration boxes. In these hidden cellars, beneath the sightlines of the Imperial monitors, ordinary citizens loaded modified blaster rifles and typed the frequency codes of neighboring rebel cells into their hidden long-range transmitters. Bail Organa and Mon Mothma stood inside the Chancellor's executive suite on Coruscant. Mon Mothma placed a heavy Durasteel datapad onto Palpatine's polished obsidian desk. The datapad contained the biometric signatures of 2,000 galactic senators. The blue text on the screen demanded a reduction in executive emergency powers and a transfer of military control back to the Senate. Palpatine sat in his high-backed chair, looked at the glowing text, and pushed the device to the edge of the desk with his index finger. He turned his face away from the senators and instructed his red-robed royal guards to escort them out of the office. Bail Organa clenched his jaw, turned on his heel, and walked out the heavy blast doors with Mon Mothma close behind. They took a turbo-lift down to the lower levels of the capital. They sat in the dimly lit sub-basement of the Chandrilan embassy. Moisture dripped from the overhead coolant pipes, pooling on the permacrete floor. Bail opened a secure comm channel. He spoke into the receiver, broadcasting encrypted coordinates to trusted associates scattered across the outer rim. On the industrial world of Sullust, factory workers wearing grease-stained overalls walked along the metal catwalks above the TIE fighter assembly lines. They pulled heavy hydrospanners from their tool belts and smashed the stabilizing gyroscopes on the gray starfighter wings. The crushed internal components sparked and short-circuited, sending plumes of ozone into the hot, circulated air of the factory. Stormtroopers in stark white armor rushed onto the metal catwalks, pointing their E-11 rifles, while the workers climbed down the emergency ladders and disappeared into the underground steam vents. On the jungle moon of Kashyyyk, Wookiee warriors climbed the tall Roshia trees and carried heavy thermal detonators strapped to their bandoliers. They dropped the cylindrical explosives onto the roofs of passing Imperial troop transports. The resulting blasts shattered the armor plating of the vehicles and sent thick black smoke rising above the tree canopy. On the shipyards of Corellia, dockhands took plasma torches to the fuel lines of Imperial cargo haulers. They severed the thick rubber hoses, spilling highly combustible hypermatter across the landing pads. The workers tossed lit flares into the puddles, igniting massive fires that melted the landing gear of the docked shuttles. These distinct groups operated in complete isolation from one another. On the desert plains of Ryloth, Twi'lek fighters wrapped their faces in protective cloth to block the blowing sand. They crouched behind rocky outcroppings and fired stolen Imperial rocket launchers at AT-ST scout walkers. The explosive projectiles hit the mechanical joints of the walkers, snapping the metal legs and sending the heavy command cabins crashing into the dunes. The Twi'leks dropped their launchers, ran to their waiting speeder bikes, and drove into the deep canyon networks before Imperial reinforcements could deploy from the orbital star destroyers hovering in the upper atmosphere. On the ice-covered plains of Vandor, human smugglers used fusion cutters to burn through the heavy magnetic locks on Imperial supply depots. They loaded crates of concentrated coaxium fuel and medical supplies onto hovering cargo sleds. They attached the sled harnesses to their thick snowsuits and dragged the stolen supplies into the freezing winds. Bail Organa boarded his white consular ship, the Tantive 4, and flew along the major hyperspace lanes to coordinate with the local group leaders. He met with regional commanders inside the noisy, smoke-filled cargo bays of civilian freighters. He handed them heavy metal lockboxes filled with solid gold ingots, and credits stripped of identifying serial numbers. He delivered heavy wooden crates packed with newly manufactured blaster power packs, portable deflector shield generators, thermal blankets, and long-range macro binoculars. Mon Mothma remained on Coruscant, attending the daily Senate sessions in the massive rotunda. She wore her pristine white senatorial robes and stood in her hovering repulsor pod, casting votes on local taxation tariffs. After the sessions ended, she walked back to her quarters, locked the heavy metal doors, and activated a specialized holotransmitter hidden behind a decorative wall panel. She transmitted flight coordinates and Imperial troop deployment schedules to the local cells operating in the mid-rim. The encrypted transmission frequencies traveled through the relay satellites, bouncing from system to system across the vast expanse of the galaxy. Astromech droids hiding in damp subterranean caves recorded the numeric codes and projected them onto portable holographic tables for the local cell leaders to read and memorize. The physical supply drops and data transfers created a web of communication between the scattered groups. One specific encrypted transmission reached a small yellow-painted freighter flying above the tall yellow grass of the planet Lothal. Inside the cramped cockpit, a human male with a blaster strapped to his thigh and a metal lightsaber cylinder hidden inside his canvas travel pack sat in the pilot's seat. He reached forward and toggled the communication switches on the console. Beside him stood a young boy from the streets of Lothal, wearing a worn orange vest and looking out the viewport at the approaching Imperial communications tower. The pilot pushed the flight throttle forward, steering the ship directly toward the glowing red lights of the Imperial facility. The pilot of the yellow freighter was a human male named Kanan Jarrus, a former Jedi Padawan who had survived Order 66 by hiding his identity and taking jobs as a cargo hauler. He worked alongside a small crew consisting of a Twi'lek pilot named Hera Syndulla, a Lasat warrior named Zeb Aurelios, and a Mandalorian explosives expert named Sabine Wren. They operated from their ship, the Ghost, running independent sabotage missions against Imperial supply lines across the Lothal sector. The young boy standing beside Kanan was Ezra Bridger, an orphan from the streets of Lothal who possessed a strong, untrained connection to the Force. Kanan had recently taken Ezra as his apprentice, passing down the basic forms of lightsaber combat and the tenets of the Jedi Code during quiet moments in the ship's cargo hold. The Ghost descended through the atmosphere, its engines whining as Kanan leveled the ship just above the tall grass. Sabine stood in the open side hatch, holding a heavy rotary blaster cannon and firing red bolts at the white-armored stormtroopers running out of the Imperial communications tower. Zeb jumped down from the ramp, using his massive physical strength to swing his electrostaff into the chest plates of the approaching guards, knocking them off the landing pad. Hera monitored the ship's sensors, shouting coordinates through the internal comms as Imperial TIE fighters launched from the nearby garrison. Kanan and Ezra ran toward the base of the tower, deflecting incoming blaster fire with their ignited lightsabers. They sliced through the heavy magnetic locks on the main door and accessed the central computer terminals, inserting data spikes to scramble the Imperial transmission frequencies and broadcast messages of resistance to the surrounding settlements. These constant, localized attacks drew the direct attention of the Imperial command structure. The local Moffs filed reports detailing the physical descriptions of the insurgents and the blue and green energy blades they wielded in combat. The Emperor received these reports and dispatched the Grand Inquisitor to Lothal to handle the situation personally. The Grand Inquisitor landed his customized TI Advance V1 starfighter on the planetary surface and tracked the crew of the Ghost through the industrial sectors and abandoned mining facilities. He confronted Kanan and Ezra on several occasions, locking their blades in prolonged duels inside tight corridors and atop moving repulsor trains. He used his spinning double-bladed lightsaber to overwhelm Kanan's defensive forms, driving the Jedi backward and forcing the crew to abandon their sabotage missions and flee into hyperspace to survive. The crew of the Ghost faced a constant operational dilemma. They needed to maintain their anonymity to survive, sleeping in hidden ravines and changing their transponder codes after every jump. However, they also recognized the necessity of taking physical action against the Empire to disrupt its control over the local populations. They spent their days stealing crates of concentrated rations and medical supplies from Imperial convoys and delivering them to displaced alien communities living in the dirt-floored refugee camps outside the capital city. They hijacked Imperial walkers and drove them through the local armories, crushing the weapon racks and setting fire to the uniform storage bays. In response to the escalating property damage and the loss of military hardware, the Empire tightened its physical grip on Lothal and the surrounding systems. Imperial garrison commanders deployed advanced E-Web heavy repeating blasters at all major intersections and increased the frequency of mandatory identification checks. Stormtroopers marched into the civilian market districts, kicking over stalls that sold unapproved local produce and detaining merchants who failed to produce their taxation receipts. Star destroyers entered low orbit, hovering directly above the main population centers, casting massive shadows over the buildings and running continuous scans for the energy signatures of the Ghost. Despite the overwhelming military presence and the constant threat of the Red Blades, ordinary citizens across the sector began to notice the actions of the small rebel cell. Factory workers watched the smoke rising from the destroyed Imperial communications towers and passed the news along the assembly lines. Local farmers found the stolen ration crates left outside their doors and hid them under their floorboards before the stormtroopers arrived for inspection. The crew of the Ghost painted bright, stylized orange starbirds on the sides of the Imperial walkers they disabled, leaving a visible, physical mark of their defiance for the public to see. The localized actions of this single ship began to inspire others to commit their own small acts of sabotage, spreading a physical resistance that slowly reached beyond the borders of the Lothal sector. Bail Organa, Mon Mothma, and a handful of other trusted leaders eventually met inside the shielded command center of a hidden base. They brought together the disparate rebel cells, integrating the Twi'lek resistance fighters, the Corellian dock workers, and crews like the one aboard the Ghost into a single, structured military organization. They officially designated this unified force the Alliance to Restore the Republic. Mon Mothma stood before the gathered cell leaders, wearing her white senatorial robes, and formally outlined their shared goal, the complete removal of the Emperor and the restoration of the Galactic Senate's legislative authority. They adopted a distinct symbol to represent their unified front, a red starbird, painted on the wings of their starfighters and stitched onto the shoulders of their pilot flight suits. The Alliance commanders avoided massing their forces on a single planet, knowing that a concentrated target would invite immediate orbital bombardment from the Imperial Navy. Instead, they built small, hidden outposts in the deep craters of barren moons and inside the hollowed-out asteroids of uninhabited star systems. Rebel technicians installed portable power generators, sensor scramblers, and medical droids inside these temporary bases. When Imperial probe droids entered a system, the rebels packed their equipment into their transport ships, erased their computer databanks, and jumped to a new set of coordinates before the Star Destroyers arrived. They operated through a decentralized network of hit-and-run attacks, stealing Imperial fuel, intercepting weapons shipments, and freeing political prisoners from labor camps before retreating back into hyperspace. The Emperor responded to the formal organization of the Alliance by eliminating the final political buffer between his military and the civilian population. He issued an executive decree dissolving the Imperial Senate permanently. Imperial stormtroopers marched into the Senate rotunda on Coruscant, locked the heavy blast doors, and ordered the remaining politicians to vacate their offices. The regional Moffs and Grand Moffs assumed direct, absolute control over their assigned sectors, answering only to the Emperor and his military high command. The politicians packed their datapads and personal belongings into repulsor skiffs and returned to their homeworlds, officially ending thousands of years of continuous legislative governance in the galaxy. With the Senate dissolved, the galactic civil war shifted from isolated acts of sabotage into open, structured military conflict. Alliance starfighters engaged Imperial TIE fighters in the space lanes above contested planets. Rebel infantry troops, wearing camouflage ponchos and blast helmets, exchanged heavy fire with white-armored stormtroopers in the dense jungles of the mid-rim. The Moffs deployed their fleet armadas to blockade entire star systems suspected of harboring rebel sympathizers. Star destroyers held positions in low orbit, firing warning shots across the bows of civilian cargo ships, attempting to break the quarantine lines. The rebel commanders gathered around glowing holographic tactical tables inside their hidden bases, analyzing the shifting deployment patterns of the Imperial fleet. They tracked the movements of the star destroyers, noting specific sectors where the Empire concentrated an unusual amount of hypermatter fuel and raw durasteel plating. The intelligence reports indicated that the Empire was funneling massive amounts of resources toward a highly classified construction project located in the most remote regions of the Outer Rim. The rebel spies intercepted scrambled communications containing fragmented blueprints and intercepted supply manifests that pointed to a weapon of unprecedented scale, designed to crush the growing alliance before it could establish a permanent foothold in the galaxy. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin stood behind a polished obsidian desk inside his private quarters on the Star Destroyer Sovereign. He possessed sharp cheekbones, pale skin, and graying hair slicked flat against his scalp. He wore a crisp olive-green tunic with a high, stiff collar and black riding boots polished to a high sheen. He dragged a metal stylus across a flimsiplast sheet, writing out the specific operational parameters of his new military strategy. He submitted this physical document directly to Emperor Palpatine, outlining a methodology of governance based entirely on the application of overwhelming physical force. He detailed a system where the visual display of massive military hardware triggered immediate biological stress responses in the civilian populations. By positioning enormous capital ships above populated cities, the Empire generated acute spikes in cortisol, dilated pupils, and rapid breathing among the citizens on the ground. This physical panic drove the local dissidents to drop their weapons, lock their heavy blast doors, and submit to Imperial mandates. Tarkin argued that projecting this intense terror bypassed the logistical requirement of deploying billions of individual ground troops across the scattered star systems. To implement this strategy, Imperial shipyards accelerated the production of Imperial-class star destroyers. These gray, wedge-shaped warships measured exactly 1,600 meters from bow to stern. They dropped out of hyperspace directly above rebellious planets, breaking through the atmospheric cloud cover and casting sharp, triangular shadows across thousands of city blocks. The sheer mass of the durasteel hulls blocked the direct sunlight from reaching the streets below. The heavy sublight engines emitted a constant, bone-rattling hum that vibrated through the transparent steel windows of the local apartment complexes. Arrayed along the port and starboard trenches of these vessels, heavy turbo-laser batteries rotated on massive mechanical gimbals, pointing their long metal barrels directly at the planetary capitals. At the same time, specialized landing craft deployed battalions of stormtroopers onto the main thoroughfares. The troopers marched in synchronized columns, their white plastoid armor clicking together and their heavy boots striking the permacrete in perfect unison. They held standard-issue E-11 blaster rifles tightly across their black chest plates and rotated their white helmet visors toward the civilian onlookers. Market vendors dropped their physical merchandise onto the dirt, grabbed their children by the arms, and ran into narrow, darkened alleyways to escape the advancing patrols. Local militia fighters placed their blasters onto the ground and clasped their hands behind their heads, surrendering immediately at the sight of the overwhelming armadas and the marching infantry. Tarkin required a supreme, central asset to solidify this strategy of total psychological and physical domination. He directed the Empire's deepest resources toward the construction of a mobile deep space battle station designated as the Death Star. The technical blueprints displayed a spherical structure measuring 160 kilometers in diameter. The exterior surface resembled a small, metallic moon, covered in gray durasteel paneling, artificial geometric canyons, and thousands of glowing yellow viewport windows. The northern hemisphere featured a massive concave dish housing a composite superlaser. Imperial engineers designed this primary weapon by aligning enormous kyber crystals within a central focusing chamber. The resulting energy beam possessed enough thermal and kinetic output to penetrate a planet's crust, destabilize the molten core, and shatter the entire planetary mass into a field of drifting asteroids. The Imperial military moved the primary construction site to the high orbit of Despair, a remote penal world located in the Horus system of the Outer Rim. Heavy cargo haulers arrived daily, transferring millions of tons of raw duonium and quadanium steel to the orbital assembly yards. Thousands of automated construction droids crawled across the exposed metal scaffolding, welding thick armor plates to the equatorial trench amid the silent vacuum of space. The immense quantity of raw materials required for the station drained the physical treasuries of thousands of core worlds, causing immediate supply shortages and strict food rationing protocols across the galaxy. Imperial Security Bureau agents established heavy communication blackouts around the entire Horus system. They flooded the local frequencies with static interference and jammed all outgoing holonet signals, turning the space around Despair into a complete void on civilian star maps. Convict laborers from the planetary surface below traveled up to the orbital shipyards in cramped prison shuttles. They wore heavy metal chains around their ankles and worked inside the sealed exhaust shafts, breathing recycled air and bolting heavy power conduits to the internal reactor walls. Supervisor droids monitored their progress, shocking the workers with electrical prods when their physical movements dropped below the mandated construction quotas. The battle station expanded piece by piece over several standard years. Technicians wearing thick radiation suits installed the final focusing lenses into the primary weapon array. They connected braided power cables from the central hypermatter reactor to the super laser firing chamber. Tarkin walked across the polished black floors of the station's main overbridge, clasping his hands behind his back and looking out through the massive transparasteel viewports at the glowing green atmosphere of Despair. He watched the green turbolaser batteries rotate on their mounts and listened to the low, steady thrum of the main reactor vibrating through the metal deck plates. Simultaneously, rebel slicers, operating from damp, hidden listening posts in neighboring sectors, detected sudden spikes in encrypted Imperial data traffic. They intercepted fragmented transmission packets bouncing off the deep space communication relays. The rebel technicians decoded the binary signals and projected the stolen spherical schematics onto glowing blue holotables. The data streams originated from a high-security Imperial archive facility built among the sandy beaches and tall palm trees of the tropical planet Scarif. The rebel commanders gathered their pilots in their hidden hangars, loaded their starfighters with explosive proton torpedoes, and typed the hyperspace coordinates for the ocean world into their nav computers. A fleet of rebel starfighters dropped out of hyperspace above the tropical planet of Scarif. X-wing and Y-wing pilots pushed their flight yokes forward and fired red laser bolts into the heavy durasteel plating of the Imperial shield gate. Down on the planetary surface, rebel infantry soldiers, wearing grey blast helmets and carrying A280 blaster rifles, sprinted across the white sand beaches. They took cover behind the thick, textured trunks of palm trees and fired at the white-armored stormtroopers defending the Citadel Tower. Heavy AT-ACT cargo walkers stepped out of the shallow ocean water, firing massive laser cannons that threw columns of wet sand and pulverized coral high into the air. The rebel troops threw heavy thermal detonators at the rotating mechanical knees of the walkers, bringing the massive machines crashing down into the surf and sending waves washing over their grey armor plating. Inside the central data vault of the Citadel, Jyn Erso and Cassian Andor climbed the metallic maintenance ladders of the towering archive structure. Jyn gripped a heavy metal hard drive and pulled it from the spinning databanks, securing the physical schematics of the Death Star. They carried the heavy drive to the exposed roof of the communications tower, connected the thick hardline cables, and manually aligned the heavy transmission dish with the rebel fleet floating in orbit. Jyn pressed the transmission switches on the master console, beaming the massive digital file through the open shield gate to the rebel flagship, the Profundity. High above the planet, the massive grey sphere of the Death Star dropped out of hyperspace. Grand Moff Tarkin stood on the overbridge, clasped his hands behind his back, and ordered the gunnery chiefs to target the Imperial base itself. The primary superlaser fired a concentrated green beam that struck the ocean surface near the Citadel. The immense thermal impact instantly vaporized millions of gallons of seawater and through a solid wall of displaced earth, melted durasteel, and boiling steam hundreds of feet into the air. The expanding physical shockwave leveled the communication spires, melted the landing pads, and consumed the rebel soldiers and Imperial stormtroopers standing on the beaches. In orbit, the rebel flagship Profundity received the complete data package. A rebel technician downloaded the schematics onto a portable data card, holding the small plastic rectangle tightly in his hands. As the flagship charged its hyperdrive, Darth Vader's Star Destroyer arrived from hyperspace and collided heavily with the retreating rebel cruisers. Imperial boarding craft clamped onto the hull of the Profundity, cutting through the outer airlocks with plasma torches. Inside a darkened corridor of the flagship, Darth Vader ignited his crimson lightsaber. He walked forward, deflecting incoming blaster bolts and slicing through the metal blast doors. The red light of his plasma blade reflected off the white helmets of the rebel fleet troopers as he drove his weapon through their chest plates. He grabbed the soldiers by the throat and tossed them against the steel bulkheads. A surviving rebel trooper ran to the jammed airlock door, reached through a narrow gap in the metal, and handed the data card to the crew of the docked Corellian corvette, the Tantive 4. The crew pulled the heavy levers on the release clamps, detached the corvette from the flagship, and pushed their hyperdrive controls forward to escape into deep space. The Tantive 4 exited hyperspace above the desert planet of Tatooine. Vader's Star Destroyer followed seconds later, firing heavy green turbo laser blasts that struck the rear engine block of the white corvette. The kinetic impact disabled the primary thrusters, leaving the smaller ship drifting in the planet's orbit. Inside the narrow, white-paneled corridors of the Tantive 4, Princess Leia Organa took the data card from the ship's captain. She wore a long white dress and carried a long-barreled Defender sporting blaster in her right hand. Thick smoke filled the hallway as Imperial stormtroopers blew the main airlock door off its hinges and poured into the ship. Leia stepped back into a recessed alcove and knelt on the metal floor, grating beside a blue and white R2 series astromech droid named R2-D2. She inserted the data card directly into the droid's primary memory drive slot and recorded a short holographic video message into its internal audio receivers. R2-D2 rotated his domed head, beeped a series of binary confirmations, and rolled his heavy treads down the corridor. He bypassed the blaster fire, exchanging between the stormtroopers and the rebel guards, entering a cylindrical escape pod alongside a gold-plated protocol droid named C-3PO. R2-D2 extended a mechanical arm, triggered the launch sequence, and sealed the heavy circular hatch. Explosive bolts fired along the outer ring, ejecting the pod from the side of the captured corvette. The small metal craft plummeted through the planetary atmosphere and crashed into the rolling dunes of the Jundland wastes, leaving a long trail of scorched sand behind it. Inside the memory banks of the astromech droid rested the complete structural blueprints of the Death Star. The digital schematics detailed a specific thermal exhaust port, measuring exactly 2 meters wide, located in a trench near the station's equator. The station's lead scientist had intentionally designed this exhaust port to connect directly to the main hypermatter reactor, leaving the passage physically exposed to the surface. A proton torpedo, fired directly into this small opening, would bypass the external armor, travel down the shaft, and detonate the core, triggering a chain reaction that would instantly shatter the entire battle station. Imperial commanders remained entirely blind to this embedded structural flaw as they secured the captured princess, turned their Star Destroyer away from Tatooine, and set a course to demonstrate the full destructive capability of their new weapon on the populated core world of Alderaan. Inside the detention block of the Death Star, Princess Leia Organa sat on a flat, cold metal bench inside Cell 2187. The walls consisted of smooth black durasteel plates, secured by heavy rivets. A spherical interrogation droid floated into the room, hovering a few inches above the polished floor on a localized repulsor lift. The black machine extended a series of metal syringes, spinning surgical blades and electroshock sensor probes toward her face. A clear chemical fluid dripped from the tip of the longest needle. Later, stormtroopers escorted Leia out of the turbolift and onto the primary overbridge of the battle station. She wore heavy metal binders around her wrists. Grand Moff Tarkin stood by the main console, his hands clasped behind his back, looking through the massive transparasteel viewports. Tarkin stepped close to her face and demanded the physical coordinates of the hidden rebel base. Leia provided the name of Dantooine, a remote agricultural planet in the Outer Rim. Tarkin turned his head away from her, looked at the green and blue sphere floating outside the window, and instructed his gunnery commanders to target her homeworld of Alderaan. Down on the surface of Alderaan, Bail Organa stood on a curved white marble balcony overlooking a deep blue lake. He wore a high-collared blue tunic and watched the white clouds moving above the snow-capped mountain ranges. High in orbit, Imperial technicians inside the Death Star's firing chamber pulled heavy metal levers, pressed rows of illuminated buttons, and rotated alignment dials. 8 separate green laser beams ignited from the perimeter of the station's massive concave dish. The beams converged in the center, fusing into a single thick column of concentrated thermal energy. The superlaser struck the planetary surface. The intense heat penetrated the crust, boring through layers of rock and sediment to reach the molten core in a fraction of a second. The liquid center expanded outward, shattering the tectonic plates and breaking the entire planetary mass apart. A blinding flash of white light consumed the cities, the lakes, and the mountains, leaving behind a rapidly expanding cloud of superheated rock, dust, and metallic debris drifting in the vacuum of space. Millions of citizens perished simultaneously as the physical structure of their world disintegrated. Far away, in the hyperspace lanes, a modified Corellian light freighter called the Millennium Falcon traveled toward the Alderaan system. Inside the cramped main hold of the ship, Obi-Wan Kenobi sat on a curved, leather-padded seating ring. He closed his eyes, pressed his right hand hard against his chest, and leaned forward until his forehead almost touched his knees. He took several shallow, rapid breaths. He experienced a massive surge of bioelectric energy snapping in his mind, hearing the physical voices of millions of beings crying out before cutting to complete silence. He opened his eyes, wiped sweat from his brow, and rested his hand on the circular hollow chess table. Sitting across from him stood Luke Skywalker, a young man with unkempt blonde hair, wearing a faded white tunic. Luke held a blue lightsaber in his hands, practicing physical parries against a spherical training remote that hovered in the air. The remote fired low-level stinging bolts, leaving small red welts on Luke's arms and legs as he swung the glowing plasma blade. In the forward cockpit of the freighter, Han Solo sat in the pilot's chair, wearing a black vest over a white collared shirt. He rested his hands on the worn dual flight yokes and checked the glowing green monitors of the nav computer. Beside him sat Chewbacca, a tall Wookiee covered in thick brown fur, wearing a leather bandolier studded with metal cartridges strapped across his broad chest. Chewbacca reached up with his large paws and flipped a series of overhead toggle switches, preparing the sublight engines for deceleration. Han pulled the large hyperdrive levers back toward his chest. The swirling blue tunnel of hyperspace collapsed into distinct white star lines, slowing the ship into normal space. The viewport displayed thousands of floating, jagged asteroids and glowing red magma fragments moving through the lingering dust of the destroyed world. A single Imperial TIE fighter darted past the cockpit window, leading the Falcon directly toward the massive gray hull of the Death Star. A blue tractor beam swept over the freighter, locking onto the hull panels and pulling the ship steadily into the illuminated main hangar bay of the battle station. Once inside the hangar, the crew climbed out of the ship's hidden smuggling compartments, located beneath the metal floor grates. Luke and Han stripped the white plastoid armor from two stationed stormtroopers and placed the bucket-shaped helmets over their heads. They marched into the turbolifts with Chewbacca wearing metal wrist binders to simulate a prisoner transfer. They rode the lift up to the detention block, stepped into the security control room, and fired their stolen E-11 blasters at the Imperial officers operating the surveillance consoles. Luke ran down the corridor, unlocked the heavy magnetic seal on cell 2187, and pulled Leia out into the hallway. Stormtroopers marched out of the opposite turbolifts, firing red laser bolts down the narrow passage. The plasma blasts scorched the black durasteel walls and shattered the overhead lighting panels. Leia grabbed a blaster from Luke's hand, pointed the barrel at a metal ventilation grate on the baseboard of the wall, and blew the covering away. The group slid down the dark metal chute, landing in a deep pile of rotting food scraps and damp, compressed trash inside a municipal garbage compactor. The thick smell of stagnant water and decaying organic matter filled the enclosed space. They waded through the murky liquid, pushing aside rusted metal panels, torn rubber hoses, and broken pipes. After forcing the heavy magnetic exit hatch open, they ran through the maintenance corridors, checking the corners before sprinting across the narrow metal catwalks spanning the deep reactor shafts. Obi-Wan stepped out from a separate corridor, ignited his blue lightsaber, and engaged Darth Vader near the hangar bay doors, allowing the others to board the ramp of the waiting freighter. Luke watched the dark-robed Sith strike Obi-Wan down with a sweeping physical blow, leaving an empty brown cloak falling to the floor. The young man fired a few rapid shots at the blast doors before running up the boarding ramp. Han pushed the throttle forward, lifting the Falcon out of the hangar and accelerating away from the station. He pulled the hyperdrive levers, launching the ship toward the fourth moon of Yavin to deliver the stolen physical plans to the hidden Alliance base. The Death Star exited hyperspace on the dark side of the gas giant Yavin. The massive battle station moved slowly past the orange clouds, heading toward the fourth moon, a green, jungle-covered sphere visible in the distance. Grand Moff Tarkin sat in his rotating command chair, monitoring the orbital trajectory displayed on his console. Inside the Great Temple on Yavin 4, General Jan Dodonna stood at the front of a crowded briefing room. He pointed a laser pointer at a glowing blue holographic projection of the Death Star. He traced a line across the metal trenches on the station's surface, highlighting a small, 2-meter-wide thermal exhaust port. He explained that the port connected directly to the main reactor system and instructed the pilots to maneuver their starfighters down the Meridian Trench and fire proton torpedoes precisely into the opening. The rebel pilots sat on metal benches, wearing orange flight suits and white chest boxes. They held their white blast helmets in their laps and watched the hollow projection rotate. Luke Skywalker climbed down a metal ladder into the cockpit of an X-wing starfighter. He snapped his restraint harness across his chest and plugged his life support cables into the flight console. R2-D2 sat securely in the astromech socket directly behind the cockpit, rotating his dome and performing pre-flight diagnostics on the shield generators. Red and gold squadrons launched from the hangar, their S-foils locked in cruising position as they flew out of the dense jungle canopy and into the upper atmosphere. They pushed their throttles forward, engaging their sublight engines and accelerating toward the approaching battle station. As they closed the distance, the surface of the Death Star filled the entire viewport, looking like a flat plane of gray metal stretching endlessly in all directions. Green turbo-laser fire erupted from the surface towers, filling the space around the starfighters with flashing energy bolts. The rebel pilots switched their deflector shields to double front and dove directly into the equatorial trench. The walls of the trench consisted of sharp metal plating, sensor arrays, and exhaust pipes flashing past the cockpits at high speeds. TIE fighters launched from the station's hangars and pursued the X-wings into the narrow canyon. Darth Vader flew his customized black TIE Advanced behind the rebel squadron. He adjusted his targeting computer, locked his crosshairs onto a Y-wing, and squeezed his firing studs. The green laser bolts struck the rebel ship's engines, causing the craft to explode into a ball of expanding orange fire and scattering metal debris across the trench walls. He systematically shot down the rebel pilots, tracking their evasive maneuvers with precision and pulling the trigger just as they leveled out. Luke Skywalker flew his X-wing low against the metal floor of the trench, approaching the target coordinates. Vader flew close behind him, locking the targeting computer onto Luke's engine block. As Vader prepared to fire, the Millennium Falcon dropped out of the bright glare of the local sun. Han Solo pulled the triggers on his quad laser cannons, striking the TIE fighter flying next to Vader. The resulting explosion sent a piece of solar panel flying into Vader's ship. The kinetic impact spun the TIE Advanced out of control, throwing it clear of the trench and tumbling out into deep space. With the pursuit cleared, Luke reached for his targeting computer display. He remembered the physical form of Obi-Wan Kenobi, the brown robes falling empty to the floor, and he pushed the targeting apparatus away from his face. He relied on the sensory input of the Force, closed his eyes for a split second, and squeezed the firing trigger on his flight stick. Two bright pink proton torpedoes shot from the nose of the X-wing. They traveled straight down the narrow passage, turned sharply downward at a 90-degree angle, and entered the unshielded exhaust port. Luke pulled hard on the flight yoke, pointing the nose of his X-wing straight up, and accelerated away from the battle station. Deep inside the core of the Death Star, the torpedoes detonated against the hypermatter reactor. The explosive chain reaction instantly consumed the internal bulkheads, the heavy radiation shielding, and the turbo-laser command decks. Grand Moff Tarkin remained standing on the overbridge, looking out the transparent steel window, as the expanding white fire enveloped the entire structure. The Death Star erupted into a massive sphere of blinding light, scattering molten durasteel and burning debris outward in a physical shockwave that rippled across the empty vacuum of space above Yavin. Darth Vader stood on the central command walkway of the newly constructed Super Star Destroyer Executor. The massive warship measured 19 kilometers from tip to stern, featuring a dark grey durasteel hull layered with thousands of turbo-laser batteries and heavy tractor-beam projectors. Imperial technicians operating the sunken crew pits below the main bridge loaded black, multi-armed Viper probe droids into cylindrical hyperspace pods. The technicians pulled the heavy manual launch levers, firing the pods from the ventral tubes of the warship. The pods shot across the galaxy, leaving streaks of blue light in their wake, and crashed into the dirt, mud, and ice of thousands of remote planets. One of these heavy black metal pods struck the surface of Hoth, a planet covered entirely in thick glaciers and deep, shifting snowdrifts. The pod threw shards of ice into the air and created a deep, smoking crater in the frozen ground. The probe droid emerged from the wreckage, extended its metallic manipulator arms, and hovered above the snowfields on a localized repulsor lift. It activated its optical sensors and scanned the white landscape. Several kilometers away, rebel soldiers wearing thick, insulated white coats and polarized goggles rode bipedal, fur-covered tauntauns across the frozen plains. The heavy breathing of the animals created thick plumes of white vapor in the freezing air. The soldiers carried heavy macro binoculars and scanned the horizon for Imperial activity. They operated out of Echo Base, a vast network of tunnels and hangars carved directly into the side of a massive glacier. Inside the main ice caverns, rebel mechanics used fusion cutters to repair the engines of wedge-shaped T-47 snowspeeders, showering the slick, frozen floor with bright orange sparks. The Imperial probe droid recorded high-resolution optical data of a massive power generator sitting in the snow outside the main hangar doors of the rebel base. It transmitted the visual feed through a high-frequency communication channel directly back to the executor. Darth Vader viewed the blue holographic image of the generator on his command console and ordered the fleet to jump to the Hoth system. Star destroyers dropped out of hyperspace just outside the planet's asteroid field, their massive triangular hulls reflecting the light of the local sun. General Veers stood on the bridge of his flagship, fastened the chin strap of his olive-green combat helmet, and deployed the physical ground forces. Massive rectangular landing craft descended through the thick atmosphere, opened their heavy forward ramps, and unloaded blizzard force onto the snowy plains miles away from the rebel shield generator. Huge all-terrain armored transports marched across the ice toward the rebel installation. The thick durasteel legs of the AT-AT walkers crushed the packed snow, sending deep seismic vibrations through the ground and shaking the ice loose from the surrounding glaciers. Rebel infantry troops crouched inside deep trenches dug into the permafrost, aiming their heavy blaster rifles at the approaching machines. The soldiers fired red laser bolts, watching the energy blasts deflect off the thick front armor of the walkers and scatter into the snow. The AT-AT commanders adjusted their targeting visors, pulled their firing triggers, and shot heavy red plasma cannons from their chin turrets. The blasts struck the snowbanks, melting the ice into pools of boiling water and throwing rebel soldiers backward out of their defensive trenches. Luke Skywalker climbed into the cockpit of a T-47 snowspeeder and led a squadron of rebel pilots out of the hangar. The speeders flew close to the ground, kicking up high trails of white powder in their wake. They steered their craft around the massive, stomping legs of the Imperial walkers. Luke's gunner sat in the rear-facing seat, aiming a heavy harpoon gun at the back leg of an AT-AT. He squeezed the firing stud, shooting a magnetic steel harpoon attached to a high-tensile tow cable. The metal spear lodged deep into the walker's knee joint. Luke pulled his flight yoke, flying the speeder in tight, banking circles around the mechanical legs and unspooling the heavy steel cable. He wrapped the line tightly around the joints and flew away, releasing the tow cable hook. The walker took another step forward, pulled the bound cables completely taut, and pitched forward. The massive machine crashed its command cabin directly into the frozen ground, crushing the cockpit and igniting the internal fuel lines. Other Imperial walkers maintained their forward march through the smoke and debris. General Veers looked through his viewport, aligned his main cannons with the primary rebel shield generator, and fired a concentrated barrage of laser energy. The generator's metal rings exploded in a cascade of orange fire, sending massive chunks of burning metal flying across the snow. Inside the ice caverns, physical klaxons spun on the walls, washing the corridors in flashing red light. Princess Leia Organa and Han Solo ran down the melting ice tunnels, coordinating the loading of equipment onto medium transport ships. Rebel deckhands pushed hovering crates of heavy weapons and medical supplies up the loading ramps of the white transport vessels. The ships fired their sublight thrusters, lifting out of the hangar and accelerating straight up into the atmosphere, flanked by escorting X-Wing starfighters. Darth Vader landed his personal shuttle outside the ruined hangar doors. He walked down the metal ramp, his heavy black boots crunching into the fresh snow. A squad of snowtroopers wearing specialized thermal armor and white face masks followed closely behind him. They entered the ice tunnels, firing their E-11 blasters at the remaining rebel technicians, desperately pushing buttons to seal the heavy metal blast doors. Vader marched through the corridors, his red lightsaber casting a crimson glow against the frozen walls and turning the frost to steam. He reached the main command center just as the Millennium Falcon blasted its engines and flew out of the rear hangar. Vader watched the freighter escape into the gray sky, turning his helmeted head to track its flight path. He returned to his shuttle, ordered his fleet commanders to calculate the freighter's trajectory, and prepared to pursue the escaping ship into the deep asteroid fields and cloud cities of the outer sectors. Han Solo pulled back on the heavy flight yokes, steering the Millennium Falcon directly into a dense cluster of tumbling asteroids. The massive rocks spun through the vacuum of space, crashing against each other and sending sharp fragments of stone scattering across the local sector. Imperial star destroyers pursued the freighter, firing heavy green turbo-laser bolts that shattered the trailing asteroids into clouds of dust. TIE fighters flew into the narrow gaps between the spinning boulders. The pilots clipped their hexagonal solar panels against the solid rock, exploding into expanding spheres of orange fire. Han flipped a series of overhead toggle switches, cutting the primary power systems and hiding the Falcon inside a deep, jagged crater on the surface of an enormous asteroid. Darth Vader stood on the central overbridge of the Executor, looking out the transparasteel windows at the physical bombardment of the asteroid field. He turned away from the viewport and walked toward the rear of the command deck. A group of specialized mercenaries stood in a horizontal line, waiting for his instructions. Boba Fett wore dented green Mandalorian armor, gripping a compact EE-3 carbine rifle. Bosk shifted on his scaled reptilian feet, wearing a yellow flight suit. IG-88 stood perfectly rigid, its tall cylindrical metallic body covered in weapon mounts and glowing red optical sensors. Vader walked down the line, stopping in front of Boba Fett. He raised his black-gloved finger and dictated the terms of the contract, offering a massive physical payout of Imperial credits for the capture of the Millennium Falcon crew. He instructed them to capture the targets alive and intact, explicitly banning the use of disintegrator weapons. In a distant sector, Luke Skywalker landed his X-Wing starfighter on the swamp planet of Dagobah. The ship crashed through the thick tree canopy and sank into the dark, murky water of a deep bog. The air smelled of rotting vegetation, damp soil, and stagnant water. Luke stepped out of the cockpit, his boots sinking deep into the grey mud. He encountered Yoda, a small, green-skinned being with pointed ears and deep wrinkles covering his face. Yoda wore a ragged, woven cloth robe and leaned heavily on a twisted wooden Geimer stick. Luke began his physical and mental conditioning under Yoda's direct instruction. He strapped the small Jedi Master to his back using a fabric harness and ran through the dense, humid jungle. He jumped over exposed tree roots, grabbed hanging vines, and climbed steep, muddy embankments. Sweat poured down his face, and his muscles burned from the intense physical exertion. Luke stood in a small clearing, surrounded by twisting, grey tree trunks. He raised his right hand, closed his eyes, and focused his biological energy into the physical environment. Small rocks lifted from the mud, hovering in the air around him. He stacked heavier stones on top of one another, maintaining his balance while standing on one foot. Yoda sat on a nearby log, striking his wooden cane against the dirt to correct Luke's posture. As Luke's muscles trembled and his concentration wavered, the heavy stones crashed back down into the swamp water, splashing mud across his boots. Yoda demonstrated the required technique, raising his three-fingered hand toward the sunken X-Wing. The water rippled and foamed. The massive starfighter rose slowly from the bog, dripping sludge and swamp weed from its metal hull, and settled firmly onto the dry bank. Back in the asteroid field, the crew of the Millennium Falcon discovered their hiding place inside the throat of a massive space slug. Han pushed the throttle forward, flying the freighter out of the creature's gaping jaws, moments before the jaws snapped shut behind the engine wash. Imperial Star Destroyers still patrolled the sector. Han flew the Falcon directly at the bridge of an Avenger-class Star Destroyer, flipping the ship upside down and cutting the sublight engines. He clamped the landing gear directly onto the blind spot on the back of the capital ship's command tower. The Imperial Fleet Commander entered hyperspace coordinates and ordered the fleet to eject their physical garbage. The Falcon detached from the tower, floating away alongside thousands of pounds of discarded metal parts, empty ration containers, and scorched machinery. Han ignited the thrusters and plotted a course for the nearby Bespin system. Boba Fett sat inside the cockpit of his ship, the Slave One, hidden among the drifting debris. He tracked the specific engine signature of the Millennium Falcon, firing his thrusters and following the freighter from a safe distance. The Falcon descended through the thick pastel clouds of the gas giant Bespin. A massive floating structure hovered in the center of the atmosphere, supported by a central unipod and surrounded by white, rounded landing platforms. This was Cloud City, a Tibanna gas mining colony. Han landed the Falcon on platform 327. Lando Calrissian walked across the white permacrete to greet them. He wore a light blue shirt, a dark blue cape with a gold lining, and dark trousers. A cybernetically enhanced aide named Lobot stood silently beside him, wearing a glowing computer bracket wrapped tightly around the back of his bald head. Lando offered the crew shelter and repairs, leading them through the bright, pristine white corridors of the floating city. Sunlight streamed through the large circular windows, illuminating the polished floors and potted plants lining the walkways. He escorted Han, Leia, and Chewbacca to a specific set of sliding metal doors. He pressed the access panel on the wall, causing the double doors to slide apart. Darth Vader sat at the far end of a long, white dining table, his black armor creating a stark contrast against the bright room. A squad of stormtroopers stepped out from the side alcoves, raising their E-11 blaster rifles and pointing the barrels directly at the visitors. Boba Fett stepped out from the shadows holding his carbine, securing the trap and bringing the long chase to a sudden, absolute halt. Han Solo stood perfectly still, with his hands raised above his head. Two stormtroopers grabbed his arms, pulled them behind his back, and secured heavy magnetic binders around his wrists. More troopers marched into the dining room, aiming their rifles at Leia and Chewbacca. The Wookiee let out a loud roar and stepped forward, lifting his heavy furred arms. But Han turned to him and shook his head, instructing him to stand down. Imperial officers pushed the prisoners out of the dining room and down the wide white corridors of Cloud City. Darth Vader followed behind them, his black cape sweeping across the polished permacrete floor. Lando Calrissian walked beside Vader, keeping his hands open at his sides and insisting that they had a physical agreement regarding the safety of the prisoners. Vader turned his black helmet toward Lando, raised his gloved hand, and stated that he was altering the deal. The stormtroopers escorted the prisoners into a dark, industrial facility located deep within the lower levels of the city. A massive hydraulic press dominated the center of the room, positioned above a deep, circular pit. Steam hissed from the overhead pipes, and the bright orange glow of liquid carbonite illuminated the metal catwalks. Ugnaught workers wearing heavy leather aprons calibrated the control panels, checking the pressure gauges and temperature dials. Vader planned to use the carbon freezing chamber to transport Luke Skywalker back to the Emperor, but he needed to test the freezing process on a biological subject first to ensure it would not kill the young Jedi. He ordered the stormtroopers to push Han Solo onto the central hydraulic platform. Chewbacca roared again, throwing his heavy shoulders into the stormtroopers holding him. He knocked two soldiers over the metal railing and grabbed a third by the white chest plate, lifting him completely off the ground. Imperial officers drew their heavy blaster pistols, aiming directly at the Wookiee's head. Han shouted over the noise of the machinery, telling Chewbacca to stop fighting and protect the princess. The Wookiee lowered the struggling stormtrooper and stepped back, his chest heaving. The Ugnaughts activated the machinery. The hydraulic platform lowered Han down into the freezing pit. A loud hissing sound filled the room as the liquid carbonite flooded the chamber, instantly dropping the ambient temperature. Thick white vapor poured out of the pit, obscuring the platform. Mechanical clamps grabbed the edges of a solid grey rectangular block and hoisted it back up into the room. Han Solo's physical form pressed against the surface of the block, frozen in a state of suspended animation, his face contorted in a final expression of physical shock. Boba Fett stepped forward, his green armor reflecting the orange light of the control panels. He examined the carbonite block, tapping the side of his helmet to activate his internal scanners. He confirmed that the human target remained biologically alive inside the metal matrix. Vader turned to the stormtroopers, ordered them to hand the frozen block over to the bounty hunter, and instructed his officers to reset the chamber for Luke Skywalker. Outside the freezing facility, Luke Skywalker walked down the dimly lit corridors, his blue lightsaber drawn. He had flown his X-Wing away from Dagobah before completing his physical conditioning, ignoring Yoda's direct warnings. He followed the localized energy signature of Darth Vader, stepping onto the metal grating of the carbon freezing chamber. The heavy blast doors slid shut behind him. Vader stood on the opposite side of the circular pit, his red lightsaber ignited. He swung his blade at Luke, initiating a heavy physical duel that moved out of the freezing chamber and into the narrow, wind-swept access tunnels of the floating city. The two Force wielders clashed their blades against each other, showering the metal walls with bright sparks. Vader drove Luke backward onto a narrow sensor balcony, extending out over the massive central air shaft of the city. The fierce wind whipped against Luke's tan tunic as he struggled to maintain his footing on the metal grating. Vader swung his heavy blade in a tight arc, slicing cleanly through Luke's right wrist. Luke's severed hand and his blue lightsaber tumbled over the edge of the balcony, falling into the dark, endless abyss below. Luke collapsed onto the metal structure, gripping the cauterized stump of his arm and sliding backward until his back hit a vertical support beam. Vader stood over him, the red blade of his lightsaber humming in the strong wind. He looked down at the young Jedi and revealed the physical truth of their connection, stating that he was Luke's father. He extended his black-gloved hand toward Luke, offering him the chance to join the dark side and rule the galaxy together. Luke stared at the black mask, shook his head, and pushed himself off the edge of the balcony. He fell down the central air shaft, sliding through a series of smooth metal exhaust tubes and dropping out the bottom of the floating city. He caught the physical edge of a weather vane extending from the underside of the station, hanging entirely by his remaining left hand over the open clouds of the gas giant. Above the clouds, Lando Calrissian and Princess Leia fought their way back to the Millennium Falcon. They shot the stormtroopers guarding the landing pad, ran up the boarding ramp, and engaged the sublight thrusters. Lando flew the ship underneath the physical structure of Cloud City, opening the top hatch and pulling Luke inside the ship. They jumped to hyperspace, fleeing the Bespin system and leaving Han Solo frozen in the cargo hold of Boba Fett's ship. Imperial Star Destroyers blockaded the sector behind them, their heavy turbolasers silent as the Emperor's enforcer watched the Falcon escape into the dark void. A large dome of sand-scoured stone sat against the cliffs of the Tatooine desert, marking the physical entrance to the palace of Jabba the Hutt. A heavy metal door slid upward, scraping against the stone tracks, and admitted visitors into the dark subterranean corridors. Inside the main audience chamber, Jabba rested his massive, slug-like body on a raised stone dais. Thick, folded layers of green and brown skin covered his torso, and viscous slime dripped from his wide, smooth mouth onto the floor. Guards of various alien species stood along the circular walls, holding heavy vibro-axes and loaded blaster rifles. The frozen carbonite block containing Han Solo hung from a magnetic wall mount directly beside Jabba's resting place. Slave girls, wearing metallic bikinis, sat on the stone floor at the base of the dais, connected to the wall by long iron chains locked around their necks. Musicians played instruments constructed from hollow gourds and tightly stretched strings, filling the cavernous room with rhythmic, echoing noise. Princess Leia Organa walked into the audience chamber, wearing the scarred brown armor and metallic helmet of a bounty hunter named Bausch. She carried a long metal staff and demanded an audience, communicating through the helmet's vocal modulator. Later that night, while the guards slept on the stone floors, she crept toward the suspended carbonite block. She flipped the manual release switches on the side of the metal frame. The solid carbonite instantly superheated, glowing bright red and releasing thick clouds of steam into the cold air. Han Solo fell forward onto the permacrete floor, shivering violently. Ice crystals coated his face and clothing, and his eyes stared blankly forward, adjusting to the sudden light. As they walked back down the exit corridor, the heavy iron grating lifted from the windows, and the concealed lights of the chamber snapped on. Jabba and his armed mercenaries surrounded them, pointing the barrels of their blasters directly at Leia and Han. Guards grabbed Leia, stripped the armored helmet from her head, and locked a heavy iron collar around her neck, securing the other end of the chain directly to Jabba's stone dais. The following day, Luke Skywalker walked through the main archway of the palace, wearing a hooded black tunic. He held his biological left hand and his cybernetic right hand, covered by a black leather glove, open at his sides. Two Gamorrean guards holding vibro-axes stepped forward to block his path. Luke raised his hand, applied localized kinetic pressure to their windpipes using the Force, and walked past them as they dropped their weapons and clutched their throats. He stood before the stone dais and instructed Jabba to release his friends. Jabba laughed, striking a concealed panel on his throne. The metal floor grates beneath Luke's boots split apart, dropping him down a steep metal chute into a dark, circular cavern. A heavy iron portcullis rose on the far side of the room, releasing a massive rancor. The beast stood 5 meters tall, covered in thick brown scales, with long, muscular arms terminating in razor-sharp claws. It grabbed a screaming guard who had fallen into the pit alongside Luke, lifted the man into the air, and crushed his bones between rows of jagged teeth. Luke backed away from the advancing monster, his boots sliding on the damp dirt floor. He picked up a large, hollow bone from a pile of skeletal remains and wedged it vertically into the rancor's descending jaws. The beast snapped the bone in half, shaking its head and roaring loudly. Luke ran toward the open portcullis, looking at the electronic control panel mounted on the stone wall above the heavy iron gate. He picked up a solid rock from the ground, pulled his arm back, and threw the projectile precisely at the physical closing mechanism. The rock shattered the plastic panel, severing the internal wiring. The massive iron gate slammed downward along its tracks, crushing the rancor's thick skull against the stone floor and terminating its biological functions instantly. Jabba looked down through the metal floor grates, his eyes wide in anger, and ordered his guards to drag Luke and Han out of the palace to the Dune Sea. A massive repulsor lift sail barge hovered over the rolling sand dunes, accompanied by 2 smaller metal skiffs. The ships stopped directly above the great pit of Carkoon. Inside the deep crater in the sand, a stationary biological organism known as the Sarlacc opened a wide, fleshy mouth, lined with rows of inward-pointing teeth. Long, muscular tentacles whipped out from the center of the maw, wrapping around loose rocks and pulling them down into the digestive tract. Guards pushed Luke to the edge of the metal skiff, holding long pikes against his back. R2-D2 stood on the upper deck of the sail barge, opened a hidden compartment in his dome, and fired a silver metal cylinder high into the air. Luke stepped off the wooden plank, rotated his body in mid-air, and caught the cylinder. He pushed the activation stud, igniting a bright green plasma blade. Luke swung the green lightsaber, severing the wooden poles of the guards' weapons and slicing through their blaster barrels. He kicked the mercenaries off the edge of the skiff, watching them tumble into the waiting tentacles of the Sarlacc below. Boba Fett activated his jetpack, flying over from the main barge and aiming his wrist-mounted flamethrower at Luke. Han Solo swung a heavy metal pole in a wide, sweeping arc, striking the side of Fett's jetpack. The physical impact triggered the ignition thrusters, sending the bounty hunter flying in a chaotic, tumbling trajectory into the side of the sail barge and bouncing down the steep sandbank directly into the open mouth of the monster. Up on the main deck of the barge, Leia pulled the heavy iron chain connecting her to Jabba, wrapped the links tightly around his thick throat, and pulled backward with all her physical strength. The metal links crushed the Hutt's windpipe and ended his life. Leia climbed over his massive body, met Luke on the top deck, and fired the heavy deck cannon directly into the barge's propulsion engines. They jumped to the smaller skiff and flew away over the dunes as the massive ship exploded into a sphere of yellow fire. The reunited crew boarded the Millennium Falcon and lifted off the desert planet, setting coordinates to rendezvous with the growing Alliance fleet, massing near the volcanic world of Sullust, preparing for a final physical strike against a new, larger Imperial threat. High above the forest moon of Endor, the skeletal, unfinished metal frame of a second Death Star hung in low orbit. Thousands of construction droids welded durasteel panels onto the exposed superstructure, while Imperial Star Destroyers maintained a tight defensive perimeter around the construction zone. The Emperor himself had traveled from Coruscant to personally oversee the final stages of the station's assembly. He sat inside his circular throne room at the top of the central spire, dressed in heavy black robes. A large, circular view screen sat directly behind his throne, showing the green and blue surface of the forest moon below. He instructed his military commanders to deliberately leak the location and status of the new battle station to Bothan spies working for the Rebel Alliance, ensuring the Alliance High Command received the encrypted data packets detailing the station's vulnerabilities. On the surface of the Endor moon, dense forests of massive redwood trees covered the landscape. The Empire had constructed a heavy shield generator facility deep within the woods. A wide, circular metal dish sat on top of the bunker, projecting an invisible deflector shield upward through the atmosphere and wrapping entirely around the unfinished Death Star. To destroy the battle station, the rebels needed to physically disable this generator. Han Solo, Princess Leia, and a strike team of rebel commandos wearing green and brown camouflage ponchos landed a stolen Imperial shuttle on the forest floor. They moved quietly through the thick underbrush, stepping over fallen logs and avoiding the large fern-like plants. The rebel strike team encountered a native species known as Ewoks. The Ewoks were small, bipedal creatures covered in thick brown and black fur, wearing leather hoods and carrying primitive spears tipped with sharpened stones. The Ewoks lived in elaborate tree villages suspended high above the ground by thick wooden platforms and rope bridges. Princess Leia offered the Ewoks food rations and communicated with them through C-3PO, earning their trust. The Ewok warriors guided the rebel commandos through the hidden paths of the forest, bypassing the primary Imperial sensor grids and leading them directly to the back entrance of the shield generator bunker. As the rebel strike team planted explosive charges on the metal doors of the bunker, a massive contingent of Imperial troops stepped out from the surrounding trees. Whole legions of stormtroopers, accompanied by specialized scout troopers in light armor, raised their blasters and surrounded the rebels. Two-legged AT-ST walkers marched through the foliage, rotating their command cabins and pointing their heavy chin cannons at the pinned commandos. Han and Leia dropped their weapons onto the dirt, realizing the Emperor had anticipated their physical arrival and laid a trap. However, the Ewoks initiated a sudden ambush from the upper canopy of the trees. They blew hollow horns, dropped heavy boulders onto the white helmets of the stormtroopers, and swung from thick vines to knock the Imperial soldiers off their speeder bikes. The Ewoks cut thick ropes holding massive logs, sending the timber swinging down to crush the armored heads of the AT-ST walkers. In the ensuing chaos, Han and Leia retrieved their blasters, fought their way back to the bunker doors, and reconnected the detonator wires. While the ground battle raged in the forest, the rebel fleet dropped out of hyperspace above the moon. Hundreds of X-Wings, Y-Wings, and massive Mon Calamari cruisers flew straight toward the Death Star, expecting to find the shields down. As they closed the distance, the Imperial fleet moved out from behind the dark side of the moon, blocking their escape routes with a solid wall of star destroyers. The rebel ships pulled up sharply, banking away from the invisible shield and engaging the swarm of TIE fighters pouring out of the Imperial hangars. Inside the throne room of the Death Star, Palpatine watched the space battle through the view screen, smiling as the rebel cruisers took heavy fire. He sat in his black chair, his scarred face illuminated by the green flashes of the turbolasers outside. Luke Skywalker had surrendered himself to the Imperial forces on the forest moon earlier that day. Darth Vader had escorted him up to the throne room and now stood silently beside his master. Palpatine turned his yellow eyes toward Luke, attempting to provoke the young Jedi into drawing his weapon. He goaded Luke by explaining the physical trap set for his friends on the ground and the fleet in space. He ordered his commanders to fire the Death Star's primary superlaser. A massive green beam shot from the concave dish, instantly vaporizing a Mon Calamari cruiser and scattering its metal hull into molten fragments. Luke watched the ship explode, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair. He pulled his lightsaber from Vader's belt using the Force, ignited the green blade, and swung it directly at the Emperor's head. Vader activated his red blade and blocked the strike, engaging his son in a final duel that moved down the stairs and into the lower levels of the throne room. The sound of their clashing lightsabers echoed over the low hum of the station's main reactor. Luke backed away from Vader's heavy, two-handed strikes, retreating under the low metal overhang of the throne room. He deactivated his lightsaber and stepped into the deep shadows behind the thick support columns, concealing his physical presence from the Emperor's view. Vader paced slowly across the polished floorboards, dragging the tip of his red blade along the metal grating, sending a continuous shower of sparks into the dark space. He extended his senses through the Force, scanning the immediate area. When he sensed the physical existence of Luke's twin sister, Leia, he spoke aloud, projecting his voice into the shadows and suggesting that if Luke would not turn to the dark side, perhaps she would. Luke stepped out from the darkness, ignited his green blade, and charged at his father. He swung his weapon with massive kinetic force, driving Vader backward down the metal staircase. Luke hammered his blade against Vader's defenses until the Sith Lord collapsed over the railing of an elevated walkway. Luke raised his weapon and brought it down hard, severing Vader's cybernetic right hand at the wrist and sending his red lightsaber clattering down the deep reactor shaft. Palpatine watched from his throne, smiling and leaning forward in his chair. He instructed Luke to strike down his defenseless father and take his place at the Emperor's side. Luke looked down at Vader's sparking, severed mechanical wrist, then looked at his own cybernetic hand. He deactivated his lightsaber, threw the metal cylinder onto the floor, and turned to face Palpatine directly. The Emperor stood up from his chair, his yellow eyes narrowing in anger. He raised both of his pale hands toward Luke, unleashing thick streams of blue force lightning from his fingertips. The electrical current struck Luke in the chest, lifting him off his feet and throwing him against the base of the throne. The physical pain caused Luke to arch his back and cry out, his muscles seizing under the continuous voltage. Vader pulled himself up, using his remaining arm, leaning heavily against the railing of the walkway. He turned his helmet toward his master, watching Palpatine step closer to Luke and increase the intensity of the lightning. The blue light reflected off the black lenses of Vader's mask. He looked from the Emperor back to his son, who lay writhing on the floorboards. Vader stepped forward, wrapping his heavy left arm entirely around Palpatine's torso. He lifted the Emperor physically off the ground, pinning his arms to his sides. The electrical currents arced wildly around them, striking Vader's life support control box and short-circuiting his internal respiratory systems. Vader carried the struggling Emperor to the edge of the deep reactor shaft, hoisted him over the railing, and threw him downward. Palpatine fell into the dark core of the station, his physical form disintegrating in an explosion of blue energy that rushed back up the shaft and washed over Vader's collapsing body. Down on the forest moon, Han Solo rewired the internal components of the bunker's blast doors. The heavy metal doors slid open, and the rebel commandos rushed inside. They tossed heavy satchel charges into the primary power generators and ran back out into the dense foliage. A series of massive explosions rocked the facility, blowing the roof off the bunker and sending the main deflector dish crashing into the trees. In orbit, the blue holographic display on the rebel flagship confirmed the shield was down. Lando Calrissian flew the Millennium Falcon directly into the open, unfinished superstructure of the Death Star, accompanied by a small squadron of X-Wings. They navigated through the narrow, twisting metal tunnels of the internal framework, flying deeper into the center of the massive station. Lando reached the central reactor core, a massive cylindrical chamber glowing with intense white and blue energy. He fired the Falcon's concussion missiles into the main power regulator, shattering the containment field, and immediately banked the freighter into a tight turn back toward the exit tunnel. As the internal explosions began to tear through the station, Luke Skywalker dragged the heavy, armored body of his father into a small Imperial shuttle located in the main hangar bay. Vader lay on the loading ramp, his mechanical breathing labored and erratic. He asked Luke to remove his heavy black helmet. Luke pulled the heavy mask and the respiratory collar away, exposing the pale, scarred face of Anakin Skywalker. Anakin looked directly at his son with his own physical eyes, smiled faintly, and died as his biological systems finally failed. Luke carried his father's body aboard the shuttle, fired the thrusters, and flew out of the hangar bay just before the expanding wall of fire consumed the metal walls. The Millennium Falcon shot out of the surface of the Death Star a moment later, racing the physical shockwave into deep space. The massive battle station exploded into a blinding sphere of white light, scattering massive chunks of burning metal across the orbit of Endor. Down on the forest moon, the rebel soldiers and Ewok warriors looked up through the tree canopy and watched the sky light up with the explosion. That night, the Alliance gathered in the Ewok village to celebrate the end of the conflict. They built large bonfires on the wooden platforms, roasted meat over the open flames, and beat rhythmic songs on the empty white helmets of fallen stormtroopers. Luke stood quietly at the edge of the celebration, watching the flames of a separate, smaller pyre consume the black armor of Darth Vader. He turned away from the fire, rejoining his friends and standing alongside the physical remnants of the Republic they had fought to restore. The story of the Galactic Empire is one of overwhelming power, built entirely upon the physical suppression of ordinary lives, and of the quiet, persistent actions that eventually brought it down. The transition from democracy to dictatorship happened not in the shadows, but right in the open, cemented by fear and enforced by cold, grey durasteel. Yet, even the heaviest armor cracks when the foundation below it shifts. Perhaps there is some comfort in knowing that even the darkest eras eventually give way to morning. Rest now, let the fire warm your tired bones, and dream of clearer skies. Inside the armored command centers of the surviving Star Destroyers, hidden metal compartments slid open along the bulkheads. Specialized mechanical units known as Sentinel droids stepped out into the shadowed corridors. These droids possessed humanoid physical frames covered entirely in heavy, blood-red robes. Their heads consisted of a smooth, curved black glass visor. When a sentinel approached a high-ranking Imperial admiral, the black glass illuminated from within, projecting a localized, high-resolution hologram of Emperor Palpatine's scarred face. The projection moved its lips in perfect synchronization with an embedded audio recording. Palpatine delivered the instructions for the contingency. He demanded the immediate orbital bombardment and structural collapse of the Empire in the event of his physical death. The admirals stood with perfectly straight posture, gripping their datapads with sweating hands. They listened to the recorded voice order the deployment of specialized weapons against rebel strongholds and loyal Imperial planets alike. The Emperor's final directive required his surviving officers to burn the galaxy to ash, denying the physical infrastructure to any succeeding government. Imperial deck officers followed these posthumous orders, initiating the military campaign designated as Operation Cinder. Cargo lifters in the hangar bays loaded cylindrical climate disruption arrays into the launch tubes. The Star Destroyers dropped out of hyperspace in the upper orbits of targeted worlds and fired the satellites into the vacuum of space. The arrays utilized small sublight thrusters to position themselves into interconnected geometric grids above the continents. Once locked into formation, the satellites deployed wide solar collection panels and aimed focused energy projectors downward at the planetary surfaces. The machines fired continuous, invisible microwave beams directly into the upper atmosphere. The sudden infusion of thermal energy caused severe physical reactions within the atmospheric pressure systems. Clear blue skies turned a bruised, violent black within minutes. Massive electrical storms formed over the population centers, dropping the temperature and generating cyclonic winds that tore the communication antennas from the roofs of the city structures. The Star Destroyers targeted Vardos, an Imperial stronghold known for fulfilling every Imperial production quota over the decades. The climate arrays ignited the atmosphere above the pristine urban sectors. Thick hailstones the size of speeder engines fell from the black clouds, crashing through the glass skylights of the administrative buildings and crushing the red-leafed trees lining the public walkways. Imperial citizens packed their belongings into canvas travel bags and ran across the cracked permacrete plazas, seeking shelter inside the reinforced transit stations. Stormtroopers, assigned to the local garrisons, listened to continuous static on their encrypted comm channels. They stood on the landing pads, their white armor coated in falling ash and freezing rain, watching the specialized Imperial shuttles lift off and leave them to the worsening storm. The extreme temperature fluctuations cracked the tall stone statues of Imperial heroes and shattered the protective energy domes over the residential sectors. The Empire executed the contingency exactly as programmed, physically destroying its own compliant subjects and towering architecture to fulfill Palpatine's final vengeance. Similar orbital grids deployed above Naboo, targeting the physical weather control systems of the planet. Torrential rain flooded the cobblestone streets of the capital city, washing the market stalls and transport speeders over the edge of the stone retaining walls and down the cascading waterfalls. At the same time, the leaders of the Rebel Alliance relocated their physical command structure to the planet Chandrila. Workers carried heavy wooden desks and audio terminals into a large domed assembly hall, organizing the delegates into the newly formed New Republic Senate. Mon Mothma stood at the central podium, dispatching the designated New Republic Defense Fleet to counter the Imperial attacks. X-wing starfighters launched from the hangar bays of Mon Calamari cruisers, jumping through hyperspace to the Naboo system. The pilots flew their ships directly into the violent, turbulent clouds, fighting against the heavy crosswinds. Rainwater washed over their transparent steel canopies as they locked their targeting computers onto the metal satellites holding the storm together. They fired proton torpedoes that struck the central power cores of the arrays, exploding the machines into thousands of scattered metal fragments. The destruction of the satellites broke the disruption grid, allowing natural sunlight to pierce through the dissipating black clouds. The New Republic cruisers pushed the remaining Star Destroyers out of the core worlds. Imperial captains initiated emergency hyperspace jumps, fleeing the orbital shipyards of Kuat and the towering skyscrapers of Coruscant. The triangular warships grouped together at a designated rendezvous point along the outer edge of the galaxy, following the encrypted transmission beacons planted by the Emperor decades prior. They eventually settled their massive capital ships in the skies above the deep desert wastes of the planet Jakku, gathering their remaining AT-AT walkers, TIE fighters, and stormtrooper legions for a final physical stand against the advancing New Republic forces. The desert sands of Jakku stretched out in endless rolling dunes beneath the heat of a single bright sun. The remaining Imperial fleet held a defensive formation high above the atmosphere, locking their Star Destroyers together in a tight perimeter to protect a secret Imperial weapons facility buried beneath the planetary surface. The New Republic Defense Fleet dropped out of hyperspace directly ahead of them. Massive Mon Calamari cruisers opened fire immediately, sending red and green turbo laser bolts arcing across the empty space between the two armadas. TIE fighters and X-wings engaged in chaotic dogfights, spinning around the heavy capital ships and dodging the explosive flak. A direct hit from a New Republic cruiser struck the primary engine block of the Ravager, the Super Star Destroyer serving as the Imperial Command flagship. The massive engines failed, venting burning hypermatter into space. The 19-kilometer warship pitched nose down and plummeted through the atmosphere. The impact shattered the sound barrier, sending a physical shockwave across the desert that flattened the dunes for miles before the ship drove itself deep into the sand, burying its command tower completely. Down on the surface, the physical realities of the battle mirrored the orbital collapse. Imperial commanders ordered their stormtroopers to dig trenches in the soft sand and set up heavy repeating blasters. New Republic soldiers landed in specialized dropships, deploying just outside the Imperial firing range and charging across the dunes. The sand made running difficult, filling the soldiers' boots and slowing their advance. 80 Atwalkers marched out from the Imperial lines, their heavy footpads sinking deep into the desert floor. The walkers fired their heavy chin cannons at the approaching rebel troops, turning the sand into glass from the intense heat of the plasma bolts. New Republic Y-wing bombers flew low over the battlefield, dropping physical proton bombs directly onto the armored roofs of the Imperial walkers, bringing the mechanical beasts crashing down into the sandstorms generated by the fighting. As the battle dragged on, Imperial officers realized their physical position was completely untenable. The surviving Star Destroyers in orbit began taking heavy fire, their deflector shields failing under the concentrated bombardment. High-ranking Imperial officials boarded unmarked shuttles and abandoned their troops on the ground, jumping into hyperspace and leaving the infantry to face the advancing New Republic army. The remaining stormtroopers, lacking clear orders and running low on blaster power packs, threw their weapons into the sand and raised their hands in surrender. New Republic soldiers walked through the burning wreckage of the Imperial line, securing prisoners with metal binders and cataloging the captured military hardware. The Battle of Jakku officially broke the remaining military power of the Galactic Empire, leaving thousands of destroyed starships, walkers, and scattered armor plating half buried in the desert sand. In the aftermath of the battle, representatives of the surviving Imperial remnant traveled to Coruscant. They walked into the newly re-established Senate Rotunda, flanked by New Republic security guards carrying long shock pikes. They signed a physical document known as the Galactic Concordance. The treaty outlined strict parameters for the Imperial remnant, demanding severe demilitarization, the payment of massive financial reparations to worlds harmed during the Emperor's reign, and the restriction of all remaining Imperial forces to a small cluster of designated systems in the core and inner rim. The New Republic diplomats rolled up the flimsiplast document and stamped it with the official seal, formally ending the Galactic Civil War and dissolving the authority of the Empire across the wider galaxy. However, a select group of Imperial true believers refused to sign the treaty or lay down their arms. Grand Admiral Ray Sloan, along with several high-ranking officers and political hardliners, gathered a small fleet of Star Destroyers and specialized supply ships. They utilized the secret hyperspace routes mapped out by the late Emperor's observatory networks, charting courses into the unknown regions. This vast, unexplored section of space contained violent solar storms, shifting asteroid fields, and navigational hazards that destroyed any ship attempting to cross without precise coordinates. The Imperial fleet pushed through the turbulent anomalies, leaving the known galaxy entirely behind. They arrived in the dark, uncharted systems, intent on rebuilding their physical military strength in absolute secrecy. The story of the Imperial era concludes not with a final execution, but with a quiet retreat into the deepest shadows of the galaxy. A government built on fear and overwhelming force eventually collapsed under the weight of its own oppressive structure, undone by the localized, persistent actions of ordinary beings and a few determined force wielders. The physical scars of the Empire remained scattered across thousands of worlds, from the ruined forests of Kashyyyk to the massive starship graveyards rusting in the sands of Jakku. Yet, those who survived the dark times focused their energy on rebuilding their homes, clearing away the grey durasteel and allowing the natural light to return. Rest easy now, knowing that even the longest nights must eventually end. Thank you for staying by the fire, and perhaps I'll see you again when the stars wheel around to another tale. Following the signing of the Galactic Concordance, the centralized command structure of the Galactic Empire fractured into isolated physical pieces. High-ranking Moffs and generals who refused to travel into the unknown regions established independent territories across the Outer Rim. They relied on local scavenging to replace the massive supply chains of the Coruscant logistics bureaus. Stormtroopers assigned to these regional warlords wore plastoid armor covered in carbon scoring, dried mud, and deep scratches. Separated from the automated cleaning facilities of the capital ships, the troops carried E-11 blaster rifles patched together with mismatched metal pipes and exposed electrical wiring. The soldiers replaced broken pieces of their pristine white armor with salvaged metal plates and brown leather straps. These splinter groups stationed themselves inside abandoned mining facilities, hollowed-out canyon fortresses, and aging Architens-class light cruisers hovering above sparsely populated worlds. They welded scrap metal over the blasted holes in their hull plating and painted over the scorch marks covering their main hangar bays. The warlords maintained physical control over their small territories by forming alliances with local mercenary guilds and bounty hunter syndicates. Imperial officers in faded olive-green tunics stood in the dusty streets of Outer Rim settlements, handing heavy pouches of solid Beskar iron and physical credit chits to armored mercenaries. The mercenaries wore battered chest plates, scarred helmets, and carried heavy disruptor rifles slung across their backs. They accepted the Imperial payments and flew their personal gunships across the desert plains to protect the hidden outposts and shoot high-value targets. Depleted of the massive hypermatter fuel reserves required for deep space travel, the remnant fleets remained largely stationary in the local atmosphere. Mechanics stripped power converters and solar panels from grounded TIE fighters to keep a handful of operational ships flying. The Imperial officers organized their remaining squads into heavily armed raiding parties. They drove repulsor skiffs into the civilian settlements, aiming their blasters at the locals and loading crates of food rations, coaxium fuel canisters, and raw minerals from the moisture farms into their cargo holds. Specific Imperial officers clung to the rigid physical protocols of the fallen regime while managing their diminishing resources. One Moff stationed in the outer sectors walked the narrow metal corridors of his light cruiser, wearing black leather boots, a polished black chest plate, and a crimson-lined cape. He carried a highly specialized weapon known as the Dark Saber, a Mandalorian blade emitting a flat, black plasma core surrounded by a crackling white electrical aura. He surrounded himself with specialized death troopers clad in completely black armor, their helmets projecting a scrambled, static-filled audio feed during combat operations. He sat at the head of a metal conference table, looking at the glowing blue holograms of the other surviving warlords projected from the center console. These officers argued loudly over the distribution of cloned genetic material, the shipment routes for heavy repeating blasters, and the physical coordinates of safe hyperspace lanes. They transmitted their voices across heavily encrypted channels, keeping their physical coordinates hidden from the New Republic patrol ships scanning the sector borders. The remnants prioritized the physical protection of the Imperial Science Division above standard infantry operations. Scientists wearing gray tunics featuring hexagonal blue shoulder patches worked inside hidden laboratories built directly into the rock walls of dormant volcanoes and abandoned civilian outposts. They stood over metal operating tables, utilizing mechanical extraction droids and glass vials to draw blood samples from biological subjects possessing high cellular midi-chlorian counts. The medical technicians typed sequencing codes into their glowing wall consoles, operating complex centrifuges to process the genetic material. They attempted to artificially replicate the biological markers required for force sensitivity. They stored the cloned biomatter and deformed organic specimens inside tall, cylindrical glass vats filled with thick yellow nutrient fluids. Squads of stormtroopers guarded the perimeter of these laboratories, keeping the heavy steel blast doors sealed and the exterior landing pads cleared of all civilian traffic. When local scavengers wandered too close to the perimeter walls, the troopers fired warning shots into the dirt, driving the intruders back into the wilderness. The warlords sustained their physical operations by utilizing the vast spatial distance separating the outer rim from the core worlds. The New Republic Defense Fleet concentrated its X-Wing squadrons and Mon Calamari cruisers around the highly populated planets near the center of the galaxy, establishing tight orbital blockades around the remaining major Imperial shipyards. They left the distant outer territories unmonitored. New Republic politicians sat inside the domed assembly halls of Chandrila and Hosnian Prime, voting to physically dismantle their own military forces. They directed government funding toward agricultural restoration projects, civilian medical centers, and commercial inter-system trade routes. The senators wore brightly colored silken robes and spoke into hovering audio pickups, arguing for total galactic demilitarization. Inside these bright marble-lined chambers, a specific faction of wealthy senators quietly aligned their political and financial agendas with the Imperial remnant forces hiding in the dark edges of the star maps, sending encrypted data packets and physical credit transfers to the very warlords the Republic had sworn to defeat. The Imperial remnant ships navigated the asteroid fields utilizing Sith wayfinders. These devices consisted of pyramidal glass casings housing glowing green crystalline memory banks. The central processors of the wayfinders transmitted exact flight coordinates directly into the nav computers of the Star Destroyers. Subsequently, the ships followed the data stream through a dense, chaotic web of red spatial gas and clustered asteroids. The heavy durasteel hull plating scraped against loose rocks, sending sparks flying across the viewport windows. The vessels bypassed massive gravity wells that pulled neighboring asteroids into crushing singularities. Finally, the fleet emerged into the airspace of Exegol, a rock-covered world shrouded in continuous shadow. Massive blue lightning bolts flashed continuously across the dry, cracked surface of the planet. The electrical strikes hit the dusty ground, scattering loose rock and illuminating the sharp, jagged edges of the deep canyons. Furthermore, an enormous, downward-pointing trapezoidal structure hung suspended just above the desert floor, supported by localized repulsor fields pressing downward against the dirt. This massive stone monolith served as the central Sith citadel. Giant, crumbling statues of ancient Sith lords lined the interior perimeter of the main halls. The statues featured heavily eroded facial features and thick layers of accumulated dust across their wide stone shoulders. The ambient temperature inside the structure remained near freezing, causing frost to form on the edges of the metal computer consoles. Tens of thousands of humanoids inhabited the deep subterranean levels of the citadel. These individuals formed the Sith Eternal Cult. They wore heavy, dark robes with wide hoods pulled low over their faces, exposing only pale, wrinkled chins and cracked lips. They walked in slow, synchronized lines through the damp, cavernous halls. Meanwhile, the cultists carried heavy metal incense burners swinging from thick iron chains, filling the cold air with thick, pungent black smoke. They spoke aloud in the ancient Sith language, their voices overlapping in a deep, continuous chant that echoed off the high stone ceilings. Other members of the cult sat at elevated metal workstations, pressing glowing red buttons to monitor the power output of the planetary core. Deep beneath the grand amphitheater, mechanical medical droids and specialized Sith alchemists operated a massive bioengineering laboratory. The room contained rows of tall, cylindrical glass containment vats. Thick, opaque yellow fluid bubbled inside the tanks. Surgical tubes and heavy power cables connected the vats directly to the main subterranean hypermatter reactors. Inside the liquid, biological specimens floated in various stages of physical development. Many of the bodies exhibited irregular limb proportions, oversized craniums, and exposed muscular tissue. Consequently, the medical droids monitored the life support consoles, recording the rapid cellular breakdown of the cloned tissue on scrolling flimsiplast sheets. They utilized mechanical pincers to inject stabilizing chemical compounds directly into the amniotic fluid, attempting to arrest the physical decay of the engineered bodies. One specific tank held a genetically modified strand cast, possessing a heavily scarred face, an entity the cultists would eventually dress in gold robes and designate as Supreme Leader Snoke. Below the cloning laboratories, the crust of Exegol opened into an expansive, hollow cavern large enough to house thousands of capital ships. Automated manufacturing platforms extended from the rock walls. Heavy lifting droids carried thick Durasteel armor plates and welded them onto the skeletal frames of Zyston-class star destroyers. These new warships shared the exact physical dimensions and wedge-shaped geometry of the older Imperial-class vessels, featuring distinct red markings painted along the edges of their hulls. The engineers attached an enormous, cylindrical, axial superlaser directly to the ventral underbelly of every ship in the fleet. These mounted weapons utilized massive kyber crystals and dedicated internal hypermatter reactors to generate a concentrated red energy beam capable of fracturing a planetary core. Bright sparks from the welding torches rained down into the dark abyss below the assembly lines. The Sith alchemists fed vast quantities of fresh biological material into the cloning vats to stabilize the genetic sequences and construct a permanent, force-sensitive vessel for their master. To acquire these blood samples, the cultists packaged specific operational bounties into highly encrypted physical data pucks. They loaded these glowing circular pucks onto automated courier ships and launched them back through the red gas of the hidden western sectors. The couriers delivered the pucks to the surviving Imperial warlords operating in the Outer Rim, directing the armored remnants to hunt down and capture specific biological targets to fund the secret cloning operation. The tracking fobs, distributed by the Imperial couriers, blinked with a steady red light and emitted sharp, rhythmic beeps. A Mandalorian bounty hunter wearing heavy plates of silver Beskar iron accepted one of these physical pucks. He flew his silver Razor Crest gunship to the arid, rocky surface of Arvala 7. He walked through the dusty canyons, firing his blaster pistol at the Nikto mercenaries, guarding a reinforced mud brick compound. He breached the heavy metal doors and found the physical target resting inside a hovering, egg-shaped repulsor pram. The target was a small, green-skinned infant possessing long, pointed ears and large brown eyes, belonging to the same species as the former Jedi Grandmaster Yoda. The Mandalorian attached the pram to his belt with a magnetic tether and transported the child back to the volcanic planet Nevarro. Imperial stormtroopers, wearing cracked, dirt-stained white armor, patrolled the exterior of a safe house hidden within the narrow alleyways of Nevarro. The Mandalorian handed the pram to an Imperial client wearing a heavy metal medallion and a woven green cloak. Inside the safe house, Dr. Pershing waited inside a sterilized medical laboratory. He wore a grey tunic featuring a circular patch representing the Kaminoan cloning facilities. He laid the infant onto a flat metal examination table and activated an overhead surgical lamp. He held a glass syringe and a specialized extraction needle. He pierced the skin of the infant's arm, drawing vials of dark red blood. The readouts on his medical console indicated a massive concentration of cellular midichlorians within the sample. He placed the glass vials into a refrigerated Durasteel lockbox, preparing them for immediate transport to the hidden cloning vats on Exegol. The Mandalorian interrupted the physical extraction process by blowing the main entrance open with a thermal detonator and marching into the facility. He triggered the firing mechanism on his wrist gauntlet, launching a volley of whistling bird micro-missiles. The small projectiles flew across the room, piercing the plastoid armor of the stormtroopers and dropping them to the floor. The Mandalorian retrieved the infant from the medical table, strapped the child to his chest, and walked out into the streets. The Imperial client activated his long-range comlink, contacting the local sector commander to report the loss of the highly valued biological asset. Moff Gideon piloted a specialized Outland TIE fighter into the atmosphere of Navarro. The wings of his starfighter folded inward as the ship touched down on the dirt plaza. He stepped onto the ground wearing a black cape and polished black boots. Dozens of death troopers wearing reflective black armor marched out of heavy troop transports. They carried DLT-19D blaster rifles and surrounded a local cantina where the Mandalorian and his allies had taken cover. The troopers unbolted the heavy tripod legs of an E-Web repeating blaster cannon and set the weapon on the dirt directly facing the cantina doors. Moff Gideon stepped forward, unclipped a metallic cylinder from his belt, and pressed the activation stud. The hilt emitted a flat, black plasma blade, surrounded by a glowing white electrical aura. He dragged the darksaber across the heavy Durasteel doors of the cantina, melting the metal into glowing slag and cutting a wide opening into the building. The Mandalorian and his allies fired their weapons through the gap, turned around, and escaped by breaking through a heavy iron sewage grate embedded in the floor. Gideon returned to the bridge of his Architons-class command cruiser. He recognized the physical limitations of his human stormtroopers and initiated a new military protocol. Inside the cold, unlit cargo bays of his cruiser, heavy automated machinery lowered charging racks from the ceiling. The racks held rows of Phase 3 Dark Troopers. These mechanical soldiers possessed heavy black Durasteel chassis, broad metallic shoulders, and glowing red optical sensors. They operated exclusively on internal power cells and logic processors, consisting entirely of solid circuitry and servos. Gideon pressed the deployment switches on his command console. The Dark Troopers stepped into the airlocks and fired the primary thrusters integrated into their metal boots. They launched into the sky, flying down to the surface of the planet Tython. They landed heavily on the stone blocks of an ancient ruin, grabbed the green-skinned infant from a circular seeing stone, and carried the child directly back up into the clouds. The Mandalorian assembled a physical strike team of mercenaries and fellow Mandalorians to retrieve the infant. They flew a stolen Imperial shuttle directly into the main launch tube of Gideon's cruiser. The strike team ran down the grey corridors, firing heavy blaster bolts into the chest plates of the defending stormtroopers. They breached the bridge, forced Gideon to his knees, and placed heavy magnetic binders around his wrists. The Dark Troopers activated their boot thrusters and flew toward the bridge to crush the intruders. As the mechanical fists dented the thick metal of the blast doors, a single X-Wing starfighter landed in the cruiser's main hangar. Luke Skywalker stepped out of the cockpit wearing a hooded black cloak. He carried his metal lightsaber hilt in his cybernetic right hand. He walked down the corridor toward the platoon of dark troopers, ignited his green plasma blade, and drove it directly through the thick chest plating of the leading droid. The dark troopers fired their heavy blaster rifles, filling the hallway with red energy bolts. Luke deflected the bolts with precise, sweeping motions of his blade. He raised his left hand, grasping the metal chassis of a droid using the Force, and crushed its internal processors into a compact ball of sparking scrap metal. He stepped forward, slicing the mechanical limbs off the droids and leaving their severed metallic torsos burning on the floor grates. He reached the bridge, deactivated his lightsaber, and took physical custody of the infant. The New Republic forces took possession of Moff Gideon and his cruiser, hauling the warlord into a holding cell. The strike team secured the immediate sector and locked down the ship's navigation computer. Meanwhile, specialized courier vessels carried the refrigerated blood vials through the hyperspace lanes, delivering the essential genetic material to the unseen shipyards to construct an entirely new military apparatus in the darkness. The surviving Imperial officers, stationed deep within the unknown regions, stripped away their damaged grey uniforms. They manufactured crisp black tunics and bright red armbands, physically designating their restructured military hierarchy as the First Order. Supreme Leader Snoke sat on a massive, raised obsidian throne inside a shadowed command chamber. He issued heavy, flimsy-plast blueprints to his chief military engineers. Enormous automated shipyards hung suspended in the dark voids of the unknown regions. Sparks showered the metallic hulls as welding droids attached thick armor plating to the wedge-shaped frames of Resurgent-class star destroyers. These modern vessels measured almost 3,000 meters long, featuring tiered command bridges and completely enclosed lateral flight decks. Furthermore, these engineers traveled to the ice planet Ilum, a world covered entirely in frozen glaciers and deep, snow-filled canyons. Massive plasma drills cut a wide equatorial trench directly into the icy crust of the planet. Automated excavators hauled millions of tons of crushed ice and rock out of the core, dumping the debris onto the surrounding snowfields. Technicians installed heavy thermal oscillators and magnetic containment fields into the freshly dug trench. They assembled a hyper-lightspeed weapon designed to drain thermal energy directly from a local star and store the highly volatile plasma inside the excavated planetary core. The physical extraction process consumed the star entirely, plunging the surrounding solar system into complete physical darkness. The red glow of the active containment fields reflected off the white snow, illuminating the metallic exterior of Starkiller Base. To garrison this massive installation, First Order officers initiated a widespread biological conscription program. Armored transport ships landed on isolated frontier worlds during the darkest hours of the planetary night cycle. Soldiers wearing newly forged white armor, featuring sleeker helmets with continuous black horizontal visors, marched into the homes of civilian farmers and miners. They grabbed young children from their beds, carrying the physically struggling youth into the holding bays of the transports. Inside the stark white corridors of First Order training facilities, medical droids injected the children with specialized sensory-altering chemicals. The conditioning algorithms replaced their personal memories with absolute loyalty to the Supreme Leader. Consequently, instructors forced the cadets to march on metal treadmills and fire heavy blaster rifles at physical targets for continuous hours. The recruits practiced riot control tactics, striking each other with electrified Z6 batons until their muscles bruised and their bones ached. Sweat soaked their white body gloves, and the air smelled heavily of ozone and sterile antiseptics. The commanders assigned alphanumeric designations to the cadets, printing the specific numbers on metal tags riveted directly to their plastoid armor. Simultaneously, back on the capital world of Hosnian Prime, the New Republic Senate convened inside towering structures of polished glass and shining steel. Certain senators, wearing heavy jeweled cloaks and representing the centrist political faction, walked into private soundproof rooms away from the main rotunda. They handed encrypted code cylinders and heavy metal cases of anonymous physical credits to first-order smugglers. These politicians openly proposed legislation to consolidate military power under a single executive office, while actively funding the construction of the first-order fleet. They stalled local defense initiatives by organizing lengthy committee votes and filling the Senate floor with massive stacks of physical flimsiplast regulations. Senator Leia Organa stood at her podium inside the Central Assembly Hall, pointing at glowing blue holographic sensor readouts. The data displayed the secretive movements of resurgent-class star destroyers massing in the unknown regions. The other senators turned their hovering repulsor pods away, focusing their physical attention on local trade manifests and agricultural taxation charts. Leia gathered her flimsiplast documents, walked out of the Senate building, and boarded her personal transport ship. She traveled to the lush green planet of Dakar, navigating her ship through the thick atmospheric clouds. She directed a small group of trusted mechanics, pilots, and intelligence officers to construct a localized military outpost inside the natural stone rings of the planet. The physical location of the base remained entirely hidden beneath the thick green canopy of the planetary foliage. Technicians dragged heavy power cables across the damp grass and welded rotating sensor arrays to the moss-covered rock walls. Astromech droids rolled across the muddy ground, carrying heavy hydrospanners and power cells to the stationed pilots. Mechanics repaired the rusting hulls of aging T-70 X-wing starfighters, bolting fresh gray metal plates over the exposed engine housings and wiping oil from the laser cannons. Leia stood inside the central command bunker, wearing a dark green utility vest and a specialized comlink earpiece. She organized this localized military force, identifying the group as the Resistance. Her technicians monitored the glowing radar screens, tracking the specific hyperspace coordinates of the first-order patrol ships expanding their physical borders into the known galaxy. The small group of fighters loaded additional proton torpedoes into the magazines of their starfighters, preparing their weapons for the rapidly approaching physical conflict. General Hux stood on the exposed Durasteel balcony of Starkiller Base, looking out over the frozen landscape of Ilum. The wind blew heavily across the viewing platform, snapping his long black greatcoat against his polished riding boots. He raised a physical megaphone to his mouth and addressed the thousands of stormtroopers assembled in perfect, rigid squares on the parade ground below. The soldiers stood perfectly still in their white armor, holding their F-11D blaster rifles at attention. Hux shouted into the amplifier, decrying the New Republic as an illegitimate government that supported the treasonous acts of the Resistance. He declared the absolute physical destruction of the current Senate, promising to return the galaxy to the strict order of the former empire. He concluded his speech and raised his right fist into the air. The thousands of troopers below slammed their boots against the ice and shouted in unison, their voices amplified by the valley walls. Inside the planetary control room behind the balcony, technicians typed the final firing coordinates into the main targeting console. Outside, the massive thermal oscillator roared to life, generating localized earthquakes that cracked the glaciers surrounding the equatorial trench. The containment field released its stored stellar plasma, funneling the volatile energy into the central firing chamber. The ground shook violently as a massive red beam of concentrated plasma erupted from the trench, shooting upward through the planetary atmosphere and into deep space. The beam separated into multiple distinct strands of red light as it entered hyperspace, traveling across the galaxy directly toward the Hosnian system. On the capital world of Hosnian Prime, New Republic senators stood on the balconies of their glass skyscrapers, looking up at the sky. The red beams pierced the atmosphere, striking the planetary crust with devastating kinetic force. The thermal impact vaporized the metal buildings, the oceans, and the surrounding defensive fleet instantly. The physical shockwave ripped the planet apart, leaving a rapidly expanding cloud of burning debris and radioactive gas where the capital had been. The destruction was physically visible across thousands of light years, appearing as a new, bright red nebula in the night sky. Following the attack on the capital, Supreme Leader Snoke ordered his military commanders to locate and destroy the hidden resistance base. First Order spies tracked a resistance reconnaissance flight back to the Dakar system. Hux deployed Starkiller Base, aligning the planetary superweapon to drain energy from a new sun, preparing to fire at the green planet. At the Resistance Base, technicians watched the red warning lights flash on their tracking monitors. Leia Organa authorized an immediate counterattack. Resistance pilots climbed into the cockpits of their X-Wings, started their sublight engines, and launched through the atmosphere toward the ice planet. The X-Wings dropped out of hyperspace above the frozen surface of Starkiller Base, flying low through the heavy snowstorms to avoid the orbital sensor grids. They targeted the massive thermal oscillator facility built into the side of a glacier. First Order T-fighters launched from the subterranean hangars, intercepting the resistance pilots above the mechanical exhaust vents. The dogfight filled the snowy sky with green and red laser fire. A resistance pilot pulled his flight yoke hard, flying his X-Wing directly into the open exhaust trench of the oscillator facility. He fired proton torpedoes directly into the exposed hypermatter containment cells. The torpedoes ruptured the cells, causing the unstable stellar plasma to expand uncontrollably. The internal explosions shattered the metal framework of the oscillator. Cracks formed along the icy surface of the planet as the stored solar energy breached the crust. Lava erupted through the snowfields, consuming the parade grounds and the command bunkers. Kylo Ren, an enforcer for the First Order, wearing a black mask and carrying a crossguard lightsaber, fought a physical duel against a scavenger named Rey in the snow-covered forest outside the base. The ground split open between them, forming a deep chasm of glowing magma. First Order officers ran to their evacuation shuttles, abandoning the facility as the planetary structure collapsed. The Resistance pilots pulled their starfighters up into the atmosphere, jumping to hyperspace just before the entire planet exploded, transforming the icy world into a new, burning star. The Resistance fleet quickly evacuated Dakar, loading their physical equipment onto transport ships and jumping into hyperspace just as First Order Star Destroyers arrived in the sector. However, the First Order utilized new hyperspace tracking technology, following the Resistance fleet through the hyperspace lanes and dropping out directly behind them. The massive Mega-class Star Destroyer Supremacy, measuring 60 kilometers wide, fired its heavy turbo lasers at the fleeing Resistance cruisers. The Resistance ships pushed their sublight engines to maximum capacity, staying just out of range of the heavy cannons, burning their reserve fuel to survive. The pursuit lasted for several standard days, draining the fuel tanks of the smaller Resistance vessels. Vice Admiral Holdo took physical command of the remaining Resistance cruiser, the Radius. She ordered the surviving personnel to board small, unarmed transport shuttles and fly down to the mineral planet of Crate below. Holdo remained alone on the bridge of the Radius, gripping the physical hyperdrive levers. She watched the blue holographic radar screen as the First Order fleet fired upon the defenseless shuttles. Holdo pointed the nose of her cruiser directly at the Supremacy, engaged the main hyperdrive, and pulled the levers. The Radius accelerated to light speed, physically colliding with the massive hull of the First Order flagship. The kinetic impact sheared off the entire right wing of the Supremacy, cutting through the durasteel armor and sending shockwaves that disabled the accompanying Star Destroyers, allowing the remaining Resistance shuttles to land safely on the salt-covered surface of Crate. Inside the dark, cavernous hangar of an abandoned mining facility on the desert planet of Ajan Klos, Resistance engineers unbolted the physical cannons from rusted B-wing bombers. They welded extra cargo pods onto the wings of their remaining U-wing transports, preparing to flee the system. First Order Star Destroyers dropped out of hyperspace above the planet, filling the sky with their grey, wedge-shaped hulls. A single massive dreadnought, the Fulminatrix, positioned itself directly over the main Resistance base. The dreadnought featured a flat, expanded underbelly containing two enormous orbital autocannons. First Order gunnery officers pushed the heavy-firing levers forward. The autocannons discharged massive, concentrated plasma bursts that struck the surface of the planet, punching deep, glowing craters into the rock and turning the surrounding sand into liquid glass. Poe Dameron sat in the cockpit of a heavily modified T-70 X-Wing, gripping the flight stick with both hands. He fired a specialized booster engine attached to the rear of his starfighter, accelerating instantly to attack speed. He flew directly across the flat surface of the dreadnought, dodging the heavy green turbo laser fire, tracking his ship. He squeezed his firing triggers, shooting red laser bolts into the raised point defense cannons along the hull. The cannons exploded, scattering gray metal plates into the vacuum of space. With the surface cannons disabled, a squadron of bulky Resistance bombers moved into position. The bombers flew in a tight formation, moving slowly above the dreadnought's main target cross. First Order TIE fighters swarmed the heavy ships, firing concentrated lasers that tore through the unshielded cockpits of the bombers. Burning debris cascaded down toward the Imperial ship. One remaining bomber, heavily damaged and trailing black smoke, positioned itself directly over the dreadnought's exhaust vents. Inside the spherical bomb bay, a Resistance gunner named Paige Tico kicked the heavy metal release ladder. The physical impact knocked the magnetic remote from its rack. It clattered against the metal deck and fell straight down, landing exactly on the manual release switch. The bottom bay doors snapped open. Hundreds of spherical, unguided proton bombs dropped simultaneously from the internal racks, falling in a dense, continuous stream. The bombs struck the internal hypermatter reactor of the dreadnought. A blinding flash of yellow light consumed the massive ship, splitting the grey hull down the middle and blowing the entire bow section apart. The physical shockwave tossed the remaining TIE fighters out of formation. While the battle raged above Ajan Klos, Rey stood on the rocky cliffs of Ahto, a remote ocean planet covered in scattered islands. She wore grey scavenger wraps and held the metal cylinder of Anakin Skywalker's lightsaber. She extended her hand toward Luke Skywalker, who stood staring at the grey ocean waves. He wore heavy brown robes and leaned on a carved wooden walking stick. He refused to accept the lightsaber, turning his back and walking into the stone hut built into the side of the cliff. Rey followed him, maintaining a physical presence on the island for several days. She swung the lightsaber in the damp air, slicing through the heavy seagrass and practicing the physical forms she had learned through raw instinct. Luke eventually agreed to provide minimal instruction. He directed her to sit cross-legged on a flat stone outcropping extending over the crashing waves. He instructed her to close her eyes, place her hands on the rock, and feel the physical energy connecting the sea, the moss, and the native birds flying overhead. Meanwhile, Kylo Ren piloted a specialized silencer starfighter toward the Raddus. He wore his black, chrome-lined helmet and a dark-ribbed tunic. He engaged the sublight thrusters, spinning the ship to avoid the red turbo laser fire coming from the Resistance cruiser. He pressed his firing studs, shooting twin laser bolts that blew the physical canopy off the cruiser's main hangar bay, sucking several Resistance fighters out into the vacuum of space. He pulled his ship upward, locking his targeting computer directly onto the main bridge of the Raddus. He reached out with the Force, sensing the physical presence of his mother, Leia Organa, standing behind the transparasteel viewports. He removed his finger from the firing trigger, physically unable to complete the action. However, 2 accompanying TIE fighters fired their torpedoes, shattering the bridge windows and violently ejecting the command crew, including Leia, into the freezing void. Leia drifted in the empty space, her physical body rapidly freezing in the absolute zero temperature. She opened her eyes, reached her hand forward, and pulled herself through the vacuum using the Force. She floated back to the damaged hull of the cruiser, passing through a secondary airlock. Medical droids immediately placed an oxygen mask over her face and laid her onto an automated stretcher, rolling her down the gray corridors to the medical bay. General Leia Organa survived the physical trauma of the vacuum, but the attack decimated the Resistance command structure, leaving a rapidly shrinking fleet of damaged ships running entirely on reserve hypermatter fuel to escape the relentless pursuit of the First Order Armada. Kylo Ren steered his TIE Whisper starfighter through the thick red atmospheric gas of Exegol. He landed the ship on the flat, cracked plains of the planet. He walked past massive, crumbling stone statues and stepped onto a heavy metal lift. The platform descended deep into the subterranean Sith citadel. Beneath the surface, a massive mechanical armature moved across the high stone ceiling, supporting the cloned body of Palpatine. Thick rubber tubes and heavy metal cables connected the former Emperor to the humming life support machinery. The skin on his face hung loose and pale. His fingertips ended in flat, discolored skin, and his eyes consisted entirely of a solid, milky white film. Surrounding the armature, thousands of Sith Eternal cultists stood in the tiered stone amphitheater, wearing dark robes and chanting in a continuous, low frequency. Beside the main chamber, tall cylindrical glass vats bubbled with thick yellow fluid, housing deformed organic clones of Supreme Leader Snoke. Outside the citadel, the ground cracked and splintered. Thousands of Zyston-class star destroyers pushed up through the frozen dust and ice, breaking the planetary crust. Rocks and dirt slid off their gray durasteel hulls as they hovered in the lower atmosphere. The heavy axial superlasers attached to the bellies of the warships glowed with red plasma energy. Rey flew Luke Skywalker's old X-Wing through the red gas and landed on the same rocky plain. She walked down the boarding ramp, carrying the metal lightsaber hilts of Luke and Leia Organa on her belt. She navigated the dark corridors and stepped into the massive amphitheater. Ben Solo arrived moments later, in a stolen Imperial TIE fighter. He threw his heavy blaster pistol to the ground and ran across the stone floor toward Rey. The Knights of Ren blocked his path, swinging heavy metal maces and vibro-cleavers. Rey extended her hand, pushing the Skywalker lightsaber through the physical space, connecting her to Ben via their Force dyad. Ben pulled the metal cylinder from the air, ignited the blue plasma blade, and struck the armored knights, cutting through their black breastplates and iron helmets. He ran forward and stood beside Rey at the center of the arena. Palpatine raised his hands and projected thick streams of blue Force lightning into Ben and Rey. He pulled their biological life essence into his own body. The deep wrinkles on his face smoothed out, his pale skin gained pigment, and the white film cleared from his eyes, revealing bright yellow irises. The mechanical armature detached from his spine, shifting his full physical weight onto his own feet. He lifted his hands toward the ceiling, firing massive branches of electrical current upward through the wide opening in the cavern roof. High above the planet, Lando Calrissian flew the Millennium Falcon into the Exegol atmosphere. Thousands of civilian freighters, medical frigates, and modified passenger shuttles followed the Falcon, dropping out of hyperspace in a massive, dense formation. The civilian fleet fired their laser cannons directly at the ventral superlasers of the Sith Star Destroyers. The blue lightning from Palpatine shot into the sky, striking the hulls of the civilian ships, overloading their nav computers and stalling their sublight engines. The ships dropped in altitude, falling toward the lightning-covered ground. Rey rolled onto her back, pushed her palms against the stone floor, and stood up. She detached the two metal hilts from her belt and ignited the blue Skywalker lightsaber alongside the green lightsaber of Leia Organa. She crossed the two glowing blades in front of her face in a rigid X formation. Palpatine directed the lightning away from the sky and targeted Rey directly. The electrical currents hit the crossed plasma blades, sparking and dispersing heavily against the energy field. Rey pushed her boots against the stone, walking forward step by step. She pressed the crossed blades directly into Palpatine's hands. The intense energy reflected backward, striking Palpatine's physical body. The concentrated lightning burned through his black robes, melted his flesh, and reduced his skeletal structure to scattered gray ash. The resulting physical shockwave blew the surrounding stone seats apart and sent the cultists falling into the deep, jagged crevices of the cavern. In the sky above, the electrical storm ceased, allowing the civilian ships to restart their sublight engines. Resistance fighters flew heavy troop transports above the hovering Star Destroyers, dropping physical infantry troops directly onto the grey hulls. The soldiers ran across the durasteel plating, planted magnetic thermal detonators onto the heavy cannons, and jumped back to the transports. The explosives detonated, tearing through the metal hulls. The targeted Star Destroyers lost their repulsor lift stability, tilting sideways and crashing violently into the rocky plains below, scattering burning metal debris across the desert. Days later, Rey traveled to the desert planet of Tatooine. She walked across the blowing sand and approached the empty, sand-filled moisture farm of the Lars family. The sun-bleached domes stood half-buried under the shifting dunes. Rey detached the two lightsabers from her belt. She wrapped the metal cylinders tightly in a strip of woven cloth, knelt on the ground, and pushed the bundle deep into the sand. She covered the hole and packed the dirt down with the palms of her hands. She stood up, detached a new, heavier metal hilt from her side, and pressed the activation switch. A bright yellow plasma blade ignited, emitting a low, steady hum. She deactivated the weapon, attached it back to her belt, and watched the twin suns lower behind the rolling desert hills. Local citizens across the galaxy, Pull the metal plating from the crashed star destroyers and weld the scrap into new homesteads. Green moss grows over the exposed engines of the fallen walking machines in the forests. The people light lanterns in their windows and sleep quietly in their beds. I hope you find the same rest here by the fire. Lay your head back against the wood, close your eyes, and sleep. Good night.